math, the 1.5 degrees Celsius is to remain within reach. Efforts to drive down global emissions, such as investing in clean and affordable energy, moving towards green, resilient economies, tackling deforestation, ending coal power, and focusing all efforts to protect nature must take precedence. Such solutions must be complemented by ensuring climate finance for frontline countries and utilizing the advanced scientific knowledge and superior technology available. Samoa has submitted its second nationally determined contribution with increased ambition, nuanced in specific emission reduction targets. The upcoming COP in Glasgow is our point of no return. Our commitments from there onwards will determine the future trajectory for our planet. Can we avoid a climate catastrophe in our children's lifetime? Excellencies, the ocean surrounds, protects, and provides for us ocean states. It is core to our Pacific way of life, tied explicitly to our need for climate actions in our custodianship of the world's oceans. As the Blue Pacific continent, our collective priority is to maintain the health of the ocean as well as the sustainable management of our vast and biodiverse ocean. A new 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent will reinforce the prioritization of ocean and climate change considerations in all policies and plans. A shared ocean means shared responsibility and benefits for our environment, economies, and communities. Our marine protection goals in our first ocean strategy are aligned to the Blue Leaders 30 by 30 campaign calling for protecting 30% of our global ocean by 2030. We welcome the complementarity of such initiatives. The Pacific Ocean hosts a remarkable array of biodiversity. With our Blue Pacific family, Samoa continues to prioritize both marine and terrestrial ecosystems restoration. Despite the challenges, we remain engaged in the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15 process. Together with the UNFCCC, COP26 2021 is a critical year for aligning action to tackle the climate emergency and addressing the threat posed by biodiversity loss. Securing our maritime zones against the threat of climate change-related sea level rise and preserving our existing rights and entitlements stemming from maritime zones is a fundamental importance to our Pacific region. Therefore, the leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum at their 51st meeting this year endorsed the Declaration on Preserving Maritime Zones in the face of climate change-related sea level rise. All countries must unite to prevent and reduce marine pollution, including plastics, oil spills, waste discharge, and nuclear contaminants. UN reports claim that every year, more than 8 million tons of plastics end up in the ocean. If this trend continues, by 2050, our ocean will have more plastics than fish. Pacific SIDS contribute less than 1.3% of the mismanaged plastics in the world's ocean, yet are one of the main recipients of plastics pollution and its impacts. Samoa fully supports the Ministerial Conference on Marine and Plastic Pollution aimed at agreeing on a common global approach to confront the scourge of marine plastic. Samoa fully supports finalizing the work on the legally binding instrument on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction in a timely, robust, and effective manner. Excellencies, the global food system is at a critical stage, made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic and onslaught of climate change. The Food Systems Summit held this week was instrumental in mobilizing global citizens to find transformative solutions. Samoa was pleased to be part of this important event, which encouraged shared exploration of potential for collective action. Through organized dialogues, Samoa benefited from a comprehensive assessment of the issues involved in building the sustainability of our food systems. Extreme hunger is not a concern in Samoa, as food availability is not the issue. Access to a more balanced and nutritional diet is the main concern, and this requires a return to locally produced quality, fresh foods, and less of processed imported foods. This will be key to addressing the rising burden of non-communicable diseases, which represent the single largest cause of premature mortality in the Pacific. Unhealthy diets, tobacco and alcohol use, and lack of physical exercise are the main risk factors. Samoa has for decades championed the importance of the rule of law and protection of the rights of its peoples. Many labeled the events that unfolded following our 2021 election a constitutional crisis. While these were difficult times for Samoa, it was also a key part of our journey moving forward as a mature democracy. It divided our country and tested all our key pillars of our society, our faith, our culture, and the rule of law. However, my delivering this statement as the first female Prime Minister of Samoa and bringing about a change in government after decades are testament to the fact that the rule of law has prevailed. Samoa today still remains peaceful and COVID-free despite all the challenges we face. The new government will continue to ensure safeguarding the rule of law and upholding of the human rights of its people. Special attention to vulnerable groups and strengthened social protection measures remain a priority. Samoa will be presenting its third Universal Periodic Review in November 2021. We maintain that our Christian values, unique culture, and traditions complement the human rights and fundamental freedoms we commit to promote, respect, protect, and fulfill. Excellencies, we want a future of peaceful societies, free from conflict and the threat of terrorism. We condemn all acts of international terrorism and violent extremism, which must be dealt with through international cooperation and in accordance with the UN Charter. The elimination of all forms of weapons of mass destruction is a step closer to a world of peace. The recent events in Afghanistan highlight the plight of thousands of people fleeing their homes in search of refuge and safety. we urge the global community to lend all possible humanitarian assistance to those in desperate need. Samoa continues to contribute to the peace and security agenda through its police peacekeepers. We are embracing the many advantages cyberspace offers, and our economy and quality of life are the better for it. However, we also recognize that they also pose as threats in some ways. The increasing use of information communications technology has raised issues of security and privacy. The exploitation of computers and telecommunications technology for criminal activities has increased. Incidents of hacking, virus attacks, access and dissemination, and misuse of information and network security can no longer be ignored. We look forward to actively engaging in discussions of the ad hoc committee to elaborate a comprehensive international convention on countering the use of information and communications technologies for criminal purposes. For a small developing island nation like Samoa, we rely on the collective responsibility as a global community to prevent and combat high-tech cyber and electronic crimes, including social media abuse and online child sexual exploitation. The reality for us is that the criminals are more advanced than our nations in these technologies. Thus, we need to work together to combat and eliminate these destabilizing activities. Excellencies, accelerated action to meet the promise of the 2030 Agenda and its SDGs is an imperative. COVID-19 and climate change have reversed hard-fought development gains. However, we must persist in our efforts to meet the SDGs as they provide the best hope in our fight against the pandemic and the threat of the climate crisis. We need to remind ourselves of the commitments and undertakings we made towards the full implementation of the Samoa Pathway. I thank all SIDS partners, the Secretary General and Secretariat, for their continuous support and commitment to this task. The proposed monitoring framework for the Samoa Pathway is a necessary tool for follow-up action and review. It will allow domestic and international resources to be better targeted towards greater accountability and transparency. We urge that outstanding issues relating to the framework be concluded with urgency, considering the fast approaching timeline set out in the Secretary General's report on this matter. Small island developing states face a unique set of vulnerabilities which impede their ability to achieve sustainable development. Structural factors including their size, remoteness, and exposure to climate risk and natural disasters impact socioeconomic outcomes and their ability to achieve the SDGs. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated those vulnerabilities, with many SIDS countries being particularly affected by the drop in international tourism and remittances. Consequently, the call for and endorsement of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index will allow for the inclusion of more than just income-based criteria to assess eligibility for concessional finance. Samoa thanks the resident coordinator in the SIDS that worked diligently towards the development of the MBI under the joint leadership of the UN and Government of Samoa, and in partnership with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. We are appreciative of the fact that the MBIs is a tool that provides for a richer lens on vulnerability. We look forward to the joint review of the report of the Secretary General on the way forward of the MBI and its use. Excellencies, allow me to touch briefly on the system reform of our organization. Samoa unreservedly believes that the UN is uniquely suited to coordinate and advance the cause of our global initiatives. With the structural aspects of the reforms now well consolidated, we should build on the momentum to continue effective implementation. Samoa looks forward to continuing an active role in the reform process to ensure that we have a UN that is fit for purpose and highly tuned to meet the challenges of the future. The continued strengthening of the resident coordinator system must include ending the fragmented approach at national level. We caution against a heavy regional approach that does not respond to national needs and priorities. We also further call for more clarity around the definition of roles against the inevitable constraints imposed by post-COVID-19 on resource availability in the immediate future. We continue to call for starting text-based negotiations for the reform of the Security Council. Excellencies, the fact that we continue to meet virtually is testament to the many challenges COVID-19 has placed on us. The pandemic has also directed our attention to the many code red alarms for humanity. Business as usual is not an option. We must take this opportunity for breakthrough, as the UN Secretary General puts it. For Samoa, our borders with the outside world have been closed since the advent of COVID pandemic in early 2020. We have prioritized the safety and health of our people over economic considerations. Like other countries, it was not an easy decision to take, considering the imminent economic challenges that will follow. Key to our response to COVID-19 is the full vaccination of our population. We express our deep appreciation to the COVAX facility, the UN family, regional organizations, and our development partners, especially Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, who were instrumental in Samoa accessing sufficient vaccines to cover the eligible population. Discussions will continue with New Zealand to secure relevant vaccines for our population under 17 years. Our vaccination rollout continues. To ensure full population coverage and achieve herd immunity, government introduced a whole-of-country lockdown this week for 2 days to carry out mass vaccinations. Excellencies, multilateralism and united international cooperation is our best response to the many threats we face. Building resilience at the national level can only take us so far. Samoa is confident that despite all the challenges, even existential threats for the sum of us, there is still hope if there is unity amongst our UN family. This can change our world for the better and leave hope for our future generations. Soifua.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Premier ministre et ministre des Affaires étrangères et du Commerce extérieur de l'État indépendant du Samoa, de l'allocution qu'elle vient de prononcer. Je donne maintenant la parole au représentant des Tuvalu pour qu'il introduise l'allocution du chef du gouvernement.
Mr. President, I have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce a pre-recorded video message from the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, the Honorable Ms. Takausia Natana.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the General Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the government of Tuvalu, I congratulate you on your election as President of the 76th United Nations General Assembly. Tuvalu has full confidence in your presidency. Let me also take this opportunity to thank the President of our 75th session, His Excellency Volkan Bozkır, for a successful session under his leadership, despite the challenges to the work of the General Assembly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to express Tuvalu's solidarity with Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his steadfast leadership in guiding this AUKUS body in unprecedented and difficult times given the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing conflicts in many parts of the world. Mr. President, I applaud your theme for the 76th session of the General Assembly. We are yet again reminded that since the Millennium Development Goals and now the Sustainable Development Goals, we are not on track on the Sustainable Development targets we set for ourselves. Two things are clear from the theme. That is, we cannot build resilient and sustainable economies in isolation of, first, the needs of the planet, and second, the protection of human rights. Tuvalu, with an average land elevation of no more than 2 meters above sea level, is extremely vulnerable to climate change, sea level rise, and natural disasters. How strong will the next tropical cyclone be? How much longer can our islands support our livelihoods? Is there even a future for our islands? With forced displacement due to climate change and sea level rise, what shall we do and where should we go? What about our traditional culture and heritage? What will happen to us? What happens to our human rights? Will Tuvalu remain a member state of the UN if it is finally submerged? Who can help us? And will they help us? Mr. President, these are the valid but difficult moral and political questions we and millions of people in low-lying countries and coastal areas continue to grapple with. Consequently, these same difficult questions will be asked by those of us who remain ignorant of climate change. Until we have answers to these difficult questions, sustainable development for us will only be wishful thinking and a short-term goal running on borrowed time, not a reality we can accomplish. But hope is not all lost for Tuvalu. We will cope and adapt. Statelessness is not an option for Tuvalu, and I am sure it is also not an option for any of us here today. The international community must now consider solutions to protect the rights of people affected by the impacts of climate change and to avoid chaotic responses to uncontrolled mass climate displacement. In this regard, Tuvalu is spearheading a new initiative that will be advanced by like-minded countries to advance efforts towards protecting the statehood of small atoll island nations facing existential threats from sea level rise, and preserving the sovereignty, rights, and heritage of affected nations and their populations. On the domestic front, we have streamlined building resilience to climate change, natural disasters, and external shocks into our 10-year National Sustainable Development Strategy, namely the decade 2021 to 2030. We have continued to enhance adaptation to climate change and sea level rise through the construction of raise, reclamation, and coastal protection systems, and adopting new agricultural systems to respond to climate change and sea level rise. We are grateful for the assistance provided through the Green Climate Fund, GCF, Global Environmental Facility, GEF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and other development partners to enhance our resilience to climate change. However, we must scale up this support to meet our growing adaptation needs, particularly our major development programs such as land reclamation and land elevation to strengthen our resilience to the slow onset of sea level rise, which could potentially erase our God-given land from the face of the earth. Mr. President, the cost of continuous rebuilding after every tropical cyclone and adapting to increasing sea level rise leaves little fiscal space for investment in the SDGs. Our global climate actions must focus on the root cause of climate change to break this cycle of costly and continuous rebuilding. The one obvious sustainable solution is to stop and reverse increasing global temperatures. To this end, the Kainaki II Declaration on Climate Change, endorsed by Pacific leaders in Tuvalu in 2019, calls for updated NTCs to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, a global climate finance target of $100 billion, and the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund to support urgent adaptation needs and an end to inefficient and harmful fossil fuel subsidies, including the phase out of coal. Mr. President, as we move closer to COP26, we make the same call on developed countries and major economies to demonstrate leadership. We need your commitment to fulfill the financial promises made in the Paris Agreement, including aligning global financial flows to be consistent with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The recent IPCC report on climate warns that we are inching closer to the point of no return. COP26 will be a make or break COP. To our developed countries, major economies, and emerging economies, we urge you to use your leadership roles to make COP26 a success. Climate change is already restricting our capacity to achieve sustainable development goals. Mr. President, our United Nations has in place systems and processes to guide our efforts to build resilience and build back better. We have the various international frameworks stemming from the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Istanbul Plan of Actions for LDCs, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Paris Agreement. It is evident that we also have the sources and the technology that we need. We must strive for strong political commitment. Mr. President, I therefore urge you to work to build political commitment and development cooperation with developed countries and major economies, including emerging economies. Mr. President, revitalizing the United Nations is critical to responding to our increasingly complicated global challenge. In terms of climate change, we applaud the appointment of the UNSG Special Advisor on Climate Change. And we look forward to the streamlining of climate change and security in the work of various UN bodies to build a UN system that is responsive to the needs of those most vulnerable to climate change. COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerability of our food security systems. For Tuvalu, our food security and agricultural capacity is our bloodline. It is therefore paramount to keep our oceans clean and sustainable for our people and generations to come. We look forward to the implementation of the outcomes of the UN Food System Summit to complement and scale up our existing food security systems and program to adapt better to climate change and support progress on the SDGs. Mr. President, I thank you for the recognition that to build resilience, we must respect the rights of people, and the UN must be revitalized to uphold the rights of all people of the world. People it was established to serve and protect. On this very note, Tuvalu calls for the recognition of the rights of the people of Taiwan to the UN premises. The UN system was established to serve the public interest of all peoples. Having unhindered access to the family of nations should be a right for all, not a privilege for some. It is most regrettable to see the ongoing injustice of Taiwanese people being barred from accessing UN premises for visits and meetings simply because the UN fails to recognize Republic of China Taiwan passports, which are in fact accepted by almost every country in the world. Likewise, Taiwanese media outlets and journalists cannot obtain accreditation to cover UN meetings and events. It is alarming that civic space in the UN and freedom of the press are being restricted. It is also unjustifiable that a person's access to UN premises now depends on nationality rather than on safety and security grounds. Granting Taiwanese passport holders access to UN premises is an essential step for the meaningful participation of Taiwan and the Taiwanese people in the UN system. It is also regrettable that the people of Cuba continue to face the economic burden of a long unilateral economic embargo. Keeping these measures in place has robbed Cuba of the international collaboration and assistance it has required to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and build back better. The embargo has ignored the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and neglected the human rights and the spirit of cooperation espoused in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Mr. President, as you may realize, I have been talking mainly about climate change. This is not to diminish the importance of other global challenges which Tuvalu also continues to face. Rather, it is because, for us, climate change is the single greatest threat to the lives, prosperity, and human security of our people. It is an existential threat. Tuvalu is unable to build resilience with hope, as noted in the theme of the 76th session of the General Assembly. If climate change is allowed to continue on its current trajectory. Finally, Mr. President, Tuvalu reiterates its commitment to multilateralism through unity. The Tuvalu 2021 Independence Day theme, Unity in Words and Deed, is a message I bring as a call to all members of the United Nations to embrace our shared differences and unite in action to address climate change and its impacts on humankind. Working together as the global family of the United Nations with the full respect for human rights and the needs of the planet, together we can build a sustainable future for planet Earth. I thank you, Mr. President. Tuvalu Motetua.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Premier ministre des Tuvalu de l'allocution qu'il vient de prononcer. Je donne maintenant la parole au représentant d'Antigua et Barbuda pour qu'il introduise l'allocution du chef du gouvernement.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is my honor and distinct privilege to introduce a pre-recorded version of the National Statement of Antigua and Barbuda to be presented by the Right Honorable Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, Minister of Corporate Governance, the Right Honorable Gaston Alfonso Brown, Prime Minister. I thank you.
Mr. President, Secretary General, distinguished heads, ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate you, Mr. President, on your election to the presidency of this 76th session of the General Assembly. Antigua and Barbuda assures you of our fullest cooperation as you steer our collective work in what will be a challenging year. Mr. President, I agree wholeheartedly with Secretary General Antonio Guterres that the international community is failing to deliver policies to support peace, global health, the viability of our planet, and other pressing needs. I also agree with him that the lack of a global response and a vaccination program to end the COVID-19 pandemic is a clear and tragic example of such failure. If developed countries had acted in a manner that allowed for the proper access to vaccines and medical supplies at the onset of the pandemic, globally, we would all be in a better place. Developing countries were not seeking handouts. Many of our countries paid into a global system that promised early access to vaccines. But it could not deliver because the majority of the vaccines from the major pharmaceutical companies had been bought or contracted and hoarded by a few wealthy nations, leaving the rest of the world bereft of the means to save their people. This selfish nationalism forced most nations to rely on vaccine charity, which in itself has not solved the problem of large numbers of people remaining unvaccinated throughout the world. No country wanted charity. No country wanted to beg for vaccines that should be a global good accessible to all. We were ready to pay, but the vaccines were hoarded and the pharmaceutical companies demanded prices beyond the capacity of countries whose economies were already decimated by the economic effects of the pandemic. Mr. President, the world should not witness such a spectacle again. What is significant about the COVID-19 pandemic is that years of warnings of an inevitable pandemic threat were not addressed, and there was inadequate funding and stress testing for preparedness. The nations that must bear the burden of responsibility for this lack of preparedness must be those who control the world's health systems and who did nothing to put in place the resources necessary to at least alleviate the effects of the pandemic when it came. What was also troubling was the absence of coordinated global leadership. Instead of cooperation, the world witnessed finger-pointing and conspiracy theories about where the novel coronavirus originated and who was responsible. The resulting global tension undermined multilateral institutions and cooperative action. The World Health Organization, WHO, became the scapegoat, even though it was not the management of the organization that caused it to be underfunded and under-resourced. Blame was cast at the WHO as if it is not the representatives of the powerful governments who set its priorities and determine how and where its monies should be spent and on what. Developing countries, and especially small states, Mr. President, have to be absolved from the responsibility for the lack of response because they neither control the decision-making bodies nor do they have the power to allocate funding. Often, the cries of small countries are either ignored or discarded, even on the few occasions when we actually get a seat at the table. There was no dedicated fund of the size necessary to supply medical equipment and to ensure vaccines would be available to all. International financing, when it came, was too little and too late. Nothing has changed since then. International financing to stop COVID and to deal with its impact both on health and economies is still too little. COVID-19 is still infecting people all over the world every minute of the day. People are still dying every minute of the day. Economies are still being ruined every minute of the day. And the prospect of recovery recedes every minute of the day. Mr. President, U.S. President Biden is to be congratulated for convening this week a global summit on COVID-19. He has shown great leadership, and we are grateful that the United States has committed an additional $250 million in the first instance to establish a pandemic fund at the World Bank to proactively address future biological threats and pandemics. But more is needed, and a more organized global machinery is needed under the auspices of the UN organization. In my own participation in President Biden's summit on COVID, I made it clear that the pandemic has wrecked economies in small island states, including CARICOM countries. In some states, more than 20% of gross domestic product has been lost. Unemployment has risen, poverty has expanded, and demands on the state have multiplied even as revenues have declined steeply. I told the Biden summit that for our small countries, recovering from the economic effects of COVID-19 will be protracted because hard-won economic progress has been greatly reversed. Therefore, building back will be longer and harder for small island states than it will be in larger economies with greater resources. Thousands of our people have been infected and thousands have died. Many who had not yet begun to enjoy life and others who had much to offer. I emphatically stated that the disease must be stopped. It must be stopped. Mr. President, we must stop behaving as if the pandemic has ended. It has not. I quote Secretary General Guterres again, because he is perfectly right when he said, and I quote, "The longer the virus circulates among the billions of unvaccinated people, the higher the risk that it will develop into more dangerous variants that could rip through vaccinated and unvaccinated populations alike with a far higher fatality rate," end of quote. A high rate of inoculations by rich countries with both the vaccines and the money must not be regarded as a great success. Not even for those countries, because today there is no greater truth than the mantra that no country is safe until all countries are safe. Antigua and Barbuda is committed to a global drive to inoculate 70% of the world's population by September 2022. my government has taken the action to make inoculations against COVID-19 mandatory for all public sector workers to protect lives of all Antiguans and Barbudans and certainly all visitors to our shores. We're determined to overcome the baselessly flawed arguments of those who promote resistance to vaccines, despite the fact that, sadly, the number of COVID-19 victims are rising daily. We will educate and inform our people at home, but, Mr. President, we continue to raise our voice internationally for the equitable distribution of vaccines at affordable price or prices and for reduction in the pricing of COVID-19 testing. Vaccines are a global good. They should not be a commodity for profit at the expense of human life. We also are committed to work for better global planning and preparation for any future pandemic. But while we will play our part utilizing our scarce resources, we will continue to argue for the provision of resources to poor and vulnerable countries. We didn't start the pandemic, and no virus has ever originated in the Caribbean countries or been spread from it. We have been and are victims of others who must recognize their responsibilities and act on them. In this connection, my government is extremely disturbed about incidents in which some countries have not recognized vaccines administered in Caribbean countries and have forced fully vaccinated travelers into quarantine. Governments cannot urge people to get inoculated on the basis that the best vaccine is the available vaccine and yet discriminate against vaccines that were not manufactured directly in North America and Europe. This would not only be a form of vaccine apartheid, it would defeat the objective of inoculating 70% of the world's people by this time next year. This discrimination must cease now before it becomes a norm by some developed countries. It is wrong, unjust, and patently unfair. Mr. President, my government will cooperate with all governments to protect our world, giving our young people the chance to live a safe, secure, and enjoyable life. But stopping the COVID-19 pandemic still is a global responsibility, and the burden of sharing its costs must be borne equitably. Antigua and Barbuda warns now that the international system has to prepare for future pandemics, which are surely coming, particularly as action on climate change has also been a failure. The impact of climate change will undoubtedly bring new vector-borne diseases and viruses that jump from animal to man. The World Health Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, and this very United Nations organization must start gearing up to prepare for the pandemics of the future. The UN Security Council should be treating pandemics as major security risks to the world, and it should act accordingly to use the full powers of the Council to meet these global threats. Never again, Mr. President, should the world be caught unprepared to manage and end a pandemic swiftly. Never again should millions of people be killed by a disease that could have been stopped earlier. And never again should there be such a selfish display of nationalism as we witness in the response to a global threat. The same argument applies to climate change. Mr. President, Antigua and Barbuda hopes that COP26 in Glasgow at the end of October will be an inflection point at which all nations will commit themselves to saving the planet. There is no planet B. The consequences of climate change will be catastrophic. For some small island states, it already is. Recent research published by the Royal Institute of International Affairs reveals a dire situation for the world unless action is taken now by the world's greatest polluters to significantly reduce their CO2 emissions. I now highlight some of the findings of that report. By 2040, almost 700 million people each year will likely be exposed to prolonged severe droughts of at least 6 months' duration. Many millions will die. Experts are concerned that climate change is likely to increase the prevalence of emerging infectious diseases and vector-borne diseases. They argue that climate change disrupts ecosystems and increases the risk of diseases jumping to new hosts. Scientists have been warning for many years of the probability of pandemics increasing as a result of climate change. In 2008, a study published in the journal Nature found that over the previous decade, nearly 1/3 of emerging infectious diseases were vector-borne, with the jumps to humans corresponding to changes in the climate. For instance, insects such as infection-bearing mosquitoes followed changing geographic temperature patterns. According to the research, interconnections between shifting weather patterns resulting in changes to ecosystems and the rise of pests and diseases combined with heat waves and droughts will likely drive unprecedented crop failure, food insecurity, and migration of people. All this, the report argues, could result in the potential breakdown of governance and political systems as societies become increasingly unstable due to the lack of income as well as competition over limited food supplies. The report says that experts are concerned that such situations could lead to a rise of extremist groups, paramilitary intervention, organized violence, and conflict between people and states. That should be a scenario that worries us all, for as we have seen in recent times, no nation is immune from violent strife. Mr. President, it is evident that global solidarity and firm commitments are required. Commitments that will result in emission cuts to reduce global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial levels. Equally vital is access to quality financing and climate technologies in order to save our planet. And contracting debt to pay for recovery from the effects of climate change and to build resilience is not the answer to the problems of small island states that are already burdened by debt and are the worst affected. Funding packages for small island developing states should include a significant amount of official development assistance. In other words, grants, not loans. Most states have significant debt overhang. They are simply not in a position to assume more debt, especially after the economic devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic. And Mr. President, the ODA component in funding for SIDS should not be seen as a gift or charity. Let me here thank the government of Denmark that has announced its proposal to significantly increase its contribution to climate aid. The Danish government wrote to me a few days ago to say that it has earmarked 60% of its annual grant for adaptation and resilience initiatives, especially in the most vulnerable countries. Note that Denmark is given a grant, not a loan. Mr. President, the news that Denmark will contribute more than 1% of the global collective target for climate financing is welcome with deep appreciation. It is my hope that Denmark's action will help to galvanize others to contribute their fair share to the collective efforts required to address climate change at COP26. Mr. President, industrialized countries have an obligation to assist the states most affected by climate change because they created a problem in the first instance. Climate ODA should be seen as a form of climate reparations to compensate for past climate damage. In addition to official development assistance, debt swaps and debt cancellations, climate-related debts would help small states to build financial capacity to accelerate the transition into renewable technologies. No new or significant sums of monies would be needed to achieve these debt cancellations. There would be mere book entries that will bring significant relief and sustainability to SIDS, while at the same time not creating any significant financial pressures for the industrialized countries. This is a non-confrontational form of climate justice. The alternative is that affected states may be forced to take legal action in the international courts to seek compensation for provable damage. Such a course is not one that small states would take with alacrity, but some of us may have to do so from necessity. If nothing is done by the major polluting countries, both to cease their destructive actions and to help to repair the damage that they are causing, we may be left no other choice. That is not our preference. We want global solidarity in the face of global adversity. Mr. President, there is an obvious need for a realignment of the international financial architecture to accelerate the global transition into renewables in order to achieve a carbon-neutral world within the next 2 decades. Let me point out one serious anomaly. While developed countries in North America and Europe are urging small island states and other vulnerable states to transition to alternative energy, they are providing $1.6 trillion annually to subsidize fossil fuel businesses. By contrast, the sum being made available to developing countries is a mere $2 billion a year. If developed countries simply shifted their spending from providing subsidies to fossil fuel businesses to help developing countries to cope with the impact of climate change, not only would they not have to spend one additional cent, they would also create greater opportunities for renewable energy in their own countries. The world will also be less polluted and climate change would retreat. Mr. President, I want to remind everyone that investments in nuclear armaments and other weapons cannot sustain the planet. But investment to combat climate change will certainly save our Earth, our single homeland, and our human civilization. That is why we should all work diligently at COP26 in Glasgow to strengthen everyone's commitment to 1.5 degrees Celsius for us all to stay alive. Mr. President, I have concentrated my statement at this year's Assembly on the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change because they are the 2 overarching issues that confront mankind. Dealing with them successfully is what will give future generations a chance to live in peace, prosperity, and safety. Those generations are our children and grandchildren. So what future do we want for them? Take them the glorious future we want for them and that they deserve? We certainly should. I thank you, Mr. President.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Premier ministre et ministre des Finances et de la Gouvernance d'entreprise d'Antigua et Barbuda de l'allocution qu'il vient de prononcer. Je donne maintenant la parole au représentant des îles Salomon pour qu'il introduise l'allocution du chef du gouvernement.
Mr. President, distinguished Excellencies, it is my utmost honor and privilege to introduce the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands, Honorable Manasseh Sogavare, to address the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly through a pre-recorded statement.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, on behalf of the government and people of Solomon Islands, let me take this opportunity to congratulate Your Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, and the government and people of Maldives on your election as President of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I am confident that through your able leadership, you will proficiently lead us through our agenda and serve this organization well. I assure you, as a fellow small islands developing state, of Solomon Islands' support and cooperation during your tenure in office. On this note, I also commend your predecessor, Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, for his sterling leadership of the General Assembly over the past session. I highly commend his efforts in ensuring the work of the Assembly progress despite the challenges faced by the United Nations Secretariat and Member States' mission. I wish him every success in his future Let me also use this occasion to extend my congratulations on behalf of the government and people of Solomon Islands to His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres on his reappointment as the United Nations Secretary General. The United Nations is confronted with many challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and sea level rise, and peace and security, to name a few. Tackling these global challenges effectively calls for a strong multilateral system of genuine and durable partnerships and cooperation between countries. Allow me to assure you, Secretary General Guterres, of Solomon Islands' support and cooperation as you endeavor to lead this august body to address the important issues and challenges that confront our nations and which we must all work together to address. Mr. President, the theme of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Building Resilience Through Hope to Recover from COVID-19, Rebuild Sustainability, Respond to the Needs of the Planet, Respect the Rights of People, and Revitalize the United Nations, aptly summarizes the challenges facing our world today and the collective hope that we all share to overcome these challenges. At the outset, I offer my sincerest condolences on behalf of the government and people of Solomon Islands to all who have lost loved ones to the coronavirus. We stand in solidarity with you all in the face of adversity during these unprecedented times. 18 months after the global COVID-19 pandemic was declared, the battle against the contagious disease has never been more important, complex, and challenging. More than 216 million people worldwide have been affected by this virus. More than 4.7 million people sadly died from the virus. While science has given us a breathing space through vaccines, several contagious and more lethal variants of the disease, including the Delta variant, are causing new waves of infection in many countries around the world. Concerted collective action by all United Nations members, using all forms of partnerships, bilaterally and multilaterally, is needed now more than ever to help us to collectively address the challenges all our countries are facing today. Mr. President, Solomon Islands has so far successfully controlled the spread of the virus. To date, we have recorded 20 imported COVID-19 cases on our shores. We have managed to eliminate the infections in our border quarantine facilities. I am pleased to announce we have not had an active case of COVID-19 for the last 5 months. My government is delivering on its two overarching policy objectives during these trying times, which are to protect all Solomon Islanders and other nationals living in the country against the COVID-19 virus, and secondly, to drive and keep the country's economy afloat. We are achieving these two objectives. Mr. President, COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted gaps in our health system and overall response capacities. My government is addressing this and has put in place measures to secure our borders. We have expanded our COVID-19 testing capability. The pandemic has enabled us to improve our health system and healthcare facilities throughout the country. On this note, I express my government's sincere gratitude to our development partners that have assisted us in our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I thank all donors and partners to the COVAX facilities. I thank the government of Australia, Indonesia, Japan, New Zealand, and the People's Republic of China. I also thank the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the United Nations agencies, and in particular, United Nations International Children's Agencies Fund and the World Health Organization and our regional institutions for their kind assistance and support. Your support ranging from direct financial contribution to the provisions of vaccine, equipment, medical and other operational equipment, and supplies has enabled my government to protect our people thus far from COVID-19. Your unwavering support is deeply appreciated and will continue to be needed as we go forward. Vaccination is our best defense against the virus. We associate with the voice of reason that no one is safe until everyone is safe. Cooperation in combating COVID-19 must be based on the unity and on solidarity. The world must act together to combat COVID-19. We cannot afford to be divided in our approaches. We look forward to working with all our partners going forward. Our vaccination rollout program is moving in the right direction, although not as fast as we want it to be. We have set ourselves a target of at least 90% fully vaccinated coverage of our eligible population before we consider reopening our borders. Mr. President, providing accurate information regularly about the disease and the progress in combating it has enabled our public to be better prepared and participate in our fight against COVID-19. We keep our public informed through talkback shows and my regular public address to the nation, which is broadcasted live on air and televised. In the long term, the government is in the process of finalizing its public health bill that will provide a legislative framework to effectively respond to any health crisis that may face the country in the future. On this note, I commend and thank our very hard-working healthcare workers and our frontline agencies who had worked tirelessly to protect our nation against this deadly disease. Your sacrifice and dedication are greatly appreciated. Mr. President, the negative impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on our economy had been significant. By mid-2021, our balance of trade deficit was around 96 million, 24 million higher than the previous month. This is a substantial amount for our small economy. This negative outcome stemmed from a larger fall in exports by 13% against a marginal decline in imports by 1%. Restrictions on international travel into the country has also impacted heavily on the tourism industry, forcing tourism operators to drastically scale down their operations. To keep the economy afloat, my government introduced immediate recovery measures. We implemented economic stimulus packages to drive the productive sector. We launched our YUMI Together tourism initiative. We drove several transformational and game-changing national projects to boost the economy and provide employment opportunities for our people as we try to stabilize our economy. The Pacific Labor Scheme Solomon Islands has with Australia, New Zealand, and Canada has provided needed employment for many of our youths. We have reached new heights in our partnership with Australia in labour mobility, for which we are thankful. These partnerships put human faces to our relationship with Australia, New Zealand, and Canada in the labour mobility front. They contribute to our economic recovery efforts. Mr. President, as a small island developing state, Solomon Islands continues to battle with the incremental effects of climate change and its negative impacts that threaten the livelihoods, security, and well-being of our people. The Pacific Island countries and territories have identified climate change as the single greatest threat to our people and to the planet. It is a global issue that needs a global solution. We're deeply concerned that we are falling behind in our commitments under the Paris Agreement. Already, global temperature has increased above pre-industrial level to 1.1 Celsius degree. The most recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change delivered the starkest warning yet about the deepening climate emergency. The IPCC report further stated that limiting global warming to close to 1.5 degrees Celsius or even 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels will be beyond reach in the next 2 decades without immediate, rapid, and large-scale reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We strongly call on all major greenhouse gas emitting countries to cut emissions and take more ambitious action, place the world on below 1 degrees Celsius pathway. Sadly, the current trend is driving humanity towards a 3 degrees Celsius world, which we can all agree is not the world we wish to bequeath our future generations. COP26 in Glasgow, to be held in November this year, presents an opportunity for the world to operationalize the Paris Agreement and conclude negotiation on the Paris Rulebook. Establishment of common time frame, a frame for nationally determined contribution is needed. Markets and non-market negotiations need to be concluded and loss and damage solutions to be operationalized. Further support is needed for the Warsaw Mechanism, and an adaptation fund should serve and support the Paris Agreement. The time for action is now. Mr. President, Solomon Islands is a large ocean state. Its total exclusive economic zone covers an area of just over 1.5 million square kilometers. Together with 21 other countries and territories, our total EEZ is almost 40 million square kilometers of ocean. The Solomon Islands tuna industry generates around $60 million in revenue on an annual basis and provides employment for 2,000 Solomon Islanders. Our people have a multi-dimensional relationship with the ocean. We recognize the climate-ocean nexus and call on the global community to take stronger climate action to protect our oceans. The devastating impact of plastic pollution on our fragile marine ecosystem demands a global binding agreement to reduce plastic pollution in our oceans. We support the establishment of such an agreement. As an ocean-locked state, Solomon Islands remains committed to negotiating a legally binding instrument on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. My government looks forward to an agreement that is fair, comprehensive, and one that provides capacity building for small island developing states such as Solomon Islands to fully implement. We must strive to complete this negotiation as soon as possible. Protecting the sovereignty of Solomon Islands maritime zones remains important priority of my government. We continue to work towards the completion of the delimitation of our maritime zones in accordance with the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. In this regard, my government supports the ongoing work that is being undertaken by the International Law Commission on the question of sea level rise and sovereignty. It is my government's unwavering position that once national maritime zones are deposited with the United Nations, they should never be challenged. Rights must be respected irrespective of sea level rise. This proposal preserves the principles of equity, fairness, and justice of the Convention and recognizes UNCLOS principles of legal stability, security, certainty, and predictability. 20 years ago, Solomon Islands submitted 4 continental shelf claims with the United Nations Commission on the limits on continental shelf. Once considered, these claims will further expand Solomon Islands' sovereignty. We look forward to working with the Commission to finalize consideration on the stated claims. Mr. President, Solomon Islands is a party to the 1985 South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty. We therefore would like to keep our region nuclear free and put the region's nuclear legacy behind. The ocean remains the lifeblood for our survival and would like to work with everyone to keep it blue and healthy. The United Nations was established out of the ashes of World War II. As a peace-loving state, Solomon Islands will do its part to build bridges of cooperation and highways of friendship and partnership in our region and beyond. Solomon Islands is committed to ensuring the Pacific region remains a peaceful region where its people can live free and worthwhile lives. We do not support any form of militarization in our region that would threaten regional and international peace and stability. Mr. President, Solomon Islands is in its transition phase of graduating from the least developing countries category and is scheduled to graduate by 2024. In preparing for our graduation, we have so far concluded several regional and bilateral trade agreements within the Pacific with the European Union and the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and we have a non-reciprocal trade arrangement with China. However, with the impact of COVID-19 and in-depth analysis on the health of the Solomon Islands economy will need to be done. We hope to complete this before the next triennial review. It is the view of my government that the date of graduation should be delayed due to the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic on the least developing countries. I take this opportunity to call on our development partners to also align their support and priority programs with the Solomon Islands National Development Strategy to assist Solomon Islands achieve our development objectives. Mr. President, on United Nations reform, Solomon Islands aligns with call from countries for a reform in one of the principal organs of the United Nations that is responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council will need to adapt to today's realities and support an expanded council with a small island development state's dedicated seat. It has been 16 years since world leaders called for early reform of the council. We hope negotiations could shift into text-based negotiations at this session. Mr. President, Solomon Islands recognizes the importance of human rights and subscribes to the principles of the United Nations Charter and believes genuine partnership can further promote and protect the rights of all. Solomon Islands supports the role of the Human Rights Council and the Universal Periodic Review mechanisms as a platform through which countries can engage in mutual dialogue on human rights concerns. Furthermore, I am pleased to inform this Assembly that Solomon Islands has presented its national report for the third cycle of the Universal Periodic Review. Through this report, Solomon Islands reiterated its commitment to strengthening its human rights mechanisms, including through the establishment of national human rights reporting mechanism that would allow for the timely submission of human rights reports. Solomon Islands is also committed to ratifying the UNCRC optional protocol on the sale of children, child prostitution, child pornography, and several human rights conventions. On the domestic front, Solomon Islands continues to review our national frameworks that will further promote and protect the human rights of all Solomon Islanders, in particular, the most vulnerable, such as our women, children, and people with disabilities. Mr. President, I also wish to offer my deep thanks to Cuba for the training of our medical students. More than 90 Solomon Islands medical doctors have graduated from Cuban medical schools. We note with concern the 60-year-old economic embargo imposed on Cuba remains in place, and we reiterate the call for the lifting of the embargo within the spirit and purposes of the United Nations Charters. Mr. President, decolonization remains an ongoing issue Solomon Islands follows at the United Nations. In this regard, we note the ongoing United Nations referendum process taking place in New Caledonia. The first referendum occurred in 2018, and then again in 2020. The third referendum is scheduled for 2022, and we once again urge that the process conforms to universally accepted principles and practices of self-determination defined by Resolution 1415 and 1514 or 1541-15 and other relevant resolutions of the United Nations. Finally, Mr. President, allow me to conclude by commending you again on the theme for this year's General Assembly session. It could not have come at a more critical time when we find ourselves facing the deadliest pandemic that has affected our world under our watch. The COVID-19 pandemic will shape our legacy as leaders of our countries in our world. Our responses to the pandemic will be remembered forever by those who had lost loved ones, by those that believed we could have done more but didn't, by those that felt betrayed by their leaders, and by those that were appreciative of the collective efforts of all countries of this world had undertaken to fight an invisible enemy that is only visible in the suffering and agony of those affected and those left behind. More than 4.7 million lives have been tragically lost, and millions continue to be affected by its ongoing onslaught. Let us take time to pause, to reflect on how this virus has changed our lives and the way we could do business, as we look at ways we can collaborate better to alleviate its impacts. As we continue to confront the problems and challenges that our world faces, ranging from climate change to the deteriorating health of our planet and the COVID-19 pandemic, we must remember there is more that binds us together as human race than divides us. We must dig deep and reach out to each other with a hand of friendship, and we must embrace multilateralism as an important tool to confront global challenges. Mr. President, fellow leaders of our world, I thank you for your attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Premier ministre des Îles Salomon de l'allocution qu'il vient de prononcer. L'Assemblée va entendre l'allocution de son Excellence, M. Shogel Kokala Maïga, Premier ministre et chef du gouvernement de la République du Mali. Je prie le protocole de bien vouloir accompagner son Excellence. Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, j'ai l'honneur de souhaiter la bienvenue à l'Organisation des Nations Unies, à son Excellence, M. Shogel Kokala Maïga, Premier ministre et chef du gouvernement de la République du Mali, et je l'invite à prendre la parole devant l'Assemblée.
Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée générale, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, Monsieur le Secrétaire général de l'Organisation des Nations Unies, Mesdames et Messieurs, je voudrais avant tout propos vous adresser les salutations fraternelles du peuple africain du Mali et celles du président de la transition, chef de l'État, Son Excellence le colonel Assimi Goïta. Je voudrais également, en leur nom et à mon nom propre, vous adresser, Monsieur le Président, les chaleureuses félicitations de la délégation du Mali pour votre brillante élection à la présidence de cette 76e session de l'Assemblée générale. Je félicite également votre prédécesseur, Son Excellence M. Volkan Bozkır de la République de Turquie, pour la manière remarquable avec laquelle il a dirigé les travaux de la 75e session de l'Assemblée générale. Qu'il me soit permis également de réitérer à notre secrétaire général, M. Antonio Guterres, notre haute appréciation des efforts louables qu'il continue de déployer pour la réalisation des nobles objectifs de notre organisation commune. Monsieur le Président, la 76e session ordinaire de l'Assemblée générale s'ouvre fort opportunément sur le thème de l'espoir. L'espoir de renforcer notre résilience pour nous relever de la pandémie de la COVID-19 dans un esprit de responsabilité, de coopération et de solidarité. L'espoir d'un monde plus sûr, d'un monde de sécurité humaine. L'espoir que le Sahel retrouve la stabilité et redevienne un havre de paix et un pôle de croissance et de développement. L'espoir, enfin, de revitaliser l'Organisation des Nations Unies. Le Mali souscrit pleinement à l'esprit et à la lettre de ce thème qui résume parfaitement les idéaux de notre organisation commune. C'est une lapalissade d'affirmer que le Mali et les pays du Sahel sont de nos jours confrontés à l'hydre terroriste, à l'extrémisme violent et à l'instabilité. Cela dure depuis plus d'une décennie, avec le risque d'enlisement, de banalisation ou de lassitude propre à détourner ces problématiques de l'agenda international. À notre quotidien, fait d'angoisse et de tragédie, est venue s'ajouter la pandémie de la COVID-19, avec ses effets négatifs sur l'économie et sur les conditions de vie de nos populations, déjà précaires du fait des défis économiques, politiques et humanitaires. Rarement, un pays ou une région aura été aussi durement éprouvée par l'enlisement, l'empilement des crises, plus que le Mali et les États du Sahel. C'est dans ce contexte difficile que le peuple malien, après plusieurs mois de soulèvement populaire, a choisi une autre direction à notre pays et placé tous ses espoirs dans le processus de transition politique en cours dont il est l'artisan principal. Le gouvernement de transition, que j'ai l'honneur de diriger depuis le 11 juin 2021, comprend les représentants des forces vives du Mali. Mais fait notable, il comprend aussi, dans un souci d'inclusivité, des membres des mouvements signataires de l'accord pour la paix et la réconciliation issus du processus d'Alger, ainsi que des représentants des forces politiques et sociales de notre pays. Aussitôt installés, nous avons travaillé ensemble à l'élaboration du plan d'action du gouvernement de transition qui contient un ensemble de mesures dont la mise en œuvre va assurer la prise en charge des préoccupations majeures des populations éprouvées par la crise sécuritaire, politique, sanitaire et économique. Ce plan d'action du gouvernement, adopté le 2 août 2021 par le Conseil national de transition, organe législatif transitoire, s'articule autour de 4 axes prioritaires. Il est assorti d'un chronogramme d'exécution et d'un budget prévisionnel. Le premier axe du plan d'action du gouvernement érige la sécurité au rang de priorité élevée. Il répond à l'aspiration profonde de notre peuple, à la paix, à la quiétude, au vivre ensemble, à la cohabitation pacifique, à la cohésion sociale. En effet, malgré les succès indéniables enregistrés par les forces armées maliennes et leurs alliés, auxquels je rends hommage, les menaces entretenues par le terrorisme et les autres formes de banditisme et de criminalité transnationale continuent, hélas, à endeuiller notre peuple au quotidien et à menacer les fondements de l'État. De mars 2012 à ce 25 septembre 2021, où je m'adresse à vous du haut de cette auguste tribune, la situation dans mon pays ne s'est guère améliorée, malgré le soutien international et la présence sur notre sol d'une opération de paix de l'ONU, la MINUSMA, et des forces internationales telles que l'opération française Barkhane, la force européenne Takuba et la force conjointe du G5 Sahel. La situation continue progressivement de se détériorer au point que des pans entiers du territoire national échappent au contrôle du gouvernement. Mes citoyens vivent sous l'emprise des groupes armés terroristes, dans le déni de leurs droits les plus élémentaires. Leur accès aux services de base demeure hypothétique en raison de la faible présence des services de l'État, consécutive à l'insécurité grandissante. La MINUSMA, dont je salue ici le courage et la contribution à la stabilisation du Mali, évolue dans cet environnement vulnérable avec ce que cela comporte comme menace sur elle. Face à cette situation préoccupante, le gouvernement est régulièrement et fortement interpellé par les populations maliennes, de plus en plus exigeantes vis-à-vis des pouvoirs publics et des partenaires internationaux. S'il est établi que l'un des droits fondamentaux des populations est le droit à la sécurité, la garantie de celle-ci, assurément, est l'élément de légitimation de l'État aux yeux des citoyens. Monsieur le Président, je fais ce rappel pour vous restituer l'exacte situation du calvaire qu'endurent les populations maliennes. Je le fais aussi pour nous convier tous ensemble à l'introspection afin de changer de paradigme en matière de sécurité au Sahel. Le Mali, comme vous le savez, accueille sur son territoire une opération de paix des Nations Unies et je voudrais à nouveau rendre un hommage appuyé à toutes ces femmes et à tous ces hommes qui travaillent sous la bannière de la MINUSMA dans des conditions difficiles, souvent périlleuses, pour préserver la paix et pour protéger les populations civiles. Je rappelle que notre organisation commune, l'ONU, a été bien avisée en 2013 lorsqu'elle a décidé de déployer fort opportunément la mission multidimensionnelle intégrée des Nations Unies pour la stabilisation du Mali, MINUSMA. La résolution 2100 du 25 avril 2013 établissant la MINUSMA avait considéré, je cite, que la situation au Mali constitue une menace pour la paix et la sécurité internationale et a décidé en conséquence d'agir en vertu du chapitre 7 de la Charte des Nations Unies. Dans son paragraphe 16, la résolution 2100 a fixé comme mandat initial à la MINUSMA, entre autres, je cite, d'appuyer les autorités de transition maliennes pour stabiliser la situation dans les principales agglomérations, en particulier dans le nord du pays, et, dans ce contexte, écarter les menaces et prendre activement des dispositions afin d'empêcher le retour d'éléments armés dans ces zones. La résolution 2164 du 25 juin 2014, qui a renouvelé pour la première fois le mandat de la MINUSMA pour un an, a souligné, je cite, que le terrorisme ne peut être vaincu qu'à la faveur d'une démarche suivie et globale, fondée sur la participation et la collaboration active de l'ensemble des États et organismes régionaux et internationaux, visant à contrer, affaiblir et isoler la menace terroriste. Fin de citation. En conséquence, le paragraphe 12 de la dite résolution autorisait la MINUSMA, je cite, à utiliser tous les moyens nécessaires pour accomplir son mandat dans les limites de ses capacités et dans ses zones de déploiement. Elle lui enjoint en particulier, au titre du paragraphe 13, je cite, d'étendre sa présence, notamment grâce à des patrouilles de longue portée, dans les limites de ses capacités, dans le nord du pays, au-delà des principales agglomérations et en particulier dans les zones où les civils sont en danger. Monsieur le Président, 8 ans après le déploiement de la MINUSMA, les extraits ci-dessus de la résolution 2100 de 2013 et la résolution 2164 de 2014 sont d'une évidente et brûlante actualité. Les populations maliennes sont exacerbées aujourd'hui devant les tueries de masse, des villages rasés de la carte et d'innocents civils fauchés, dont les femmes et les nourrissants souvent brûlés vifs. Les Maliennes et Maliens ont le net sentiment que la mission assignée à la MINUSMA a changé en cours de route et notamment depuis 2015, suite à la signature de l'accord pour la paix et la réconciliation issu du processus d'Alger, alors même que les défis qui ont justifié son déploiement sont restés constants. En effet, contrairement aux attentes du peuple malien, l'environnement notoirement terroriste dans lequel la MINUSMA a été déployée en 2013 s'est dégradé continuellement. Au fil du temps, il s'est même métastasé, car les groupes armés terroristes qui ont envahi près de 2/3 de notre territoire en 2012 ont été dispersés sans jamais être anéantis. Ils se sont reconstitués et se sont renforcés. C'est dans ce contexte de menaces préoccupantes que l'armée française, à travers l'opération Serval d'abord et ensuite l'opération Barkhane, a été autorisée à mener en soutien à la MINUSMA et à nos États le volet lutte contre le terrorisme au Mali. C'est également dans ce contexte, Monsieur le Président, que l'opération française Barkhane annonce subitement son retrait en vue, dit-on, d'une transformation en coalition internationale dont tous les contours ne sont pas encore connus, en tout cas pas de mon pays, pas de notre peuple. L'annonce unilatérale du retrait de Barkhane et sa transformation n'ont pas tenu compte du lien tripartite qui nous lie, c'est-à-dire l'ONU, le Mali en tant que partenaire engagé avec la France sur le front de la lutte contre les facteurs de déstabilisation. Le Mali regrette que le principe de consultation et de concertation, qui doit être la règle entre partenaires privilégiés, n'ait pas été observé en amont de la décision du gouvernement français. Aussi, la nouvelle situation née de la fin de Barkhane, plaçant le Mali devant le fait accompli et l'exposant à une espèce d'abandon en plein vol, nous conduit à explorer les voies et moyens pour mieux assurer la sécurité de manière autonome avec d'autres partenaires, de manière à combler le vide que ne manquera pas de créer la fermeture de certaines emprises de Barkhane dans le nord du Mali. Cette situation doit également inciter les Nations Unies à avoir désormais une posture plus offensive sur le terrain. Monsieur le Président, il n'existe pas de sentiment anti-MINUSMA au Mali, pas plus qu'il n'existe de sentiment anti-français dans notre pays. Non. Je le dis sans embâche. Notre peuple n'a jamais été un peuple ingrat. Au sommet de l'État et au sein des populations, il existe un désir de paix et une soif de sécurité qui font écho à l'exigence d'efficacité des instruments et des mécanismes politiques et militaires mis en place et qui font paradoxalement du Mali un pays surmilitarisé mais très vulnérable face au terrorisme, devenu un facteur de désintégration de nos États, de nos sociétés et de déstabilisation des fondements de nos pays. Que devrions-nous faire face à un tel paradoxe? Que faut-il faire pour répondre à l'angoisse, à l'exaspération et à la colère des populations maliennes? Que faut-il faire pour répondre au sentiment d'insatisfaction à la fois des Maliens et des partenaires du Mali? Je pense humblement, Monsieur le Président, que face à ces interrogations, nous devons avoir le courage et la lucidité d'interroger les instruments et les mécanismes évoqués plus haut. Nous devrions aussi et surtout remettre sur la table la demande d'un mandat plus robuste et d'un changement de posture de la MINUSMA, régulièrement fait par le gouvernement au Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU. Ceci permettra d'adapter le mandat de la MINUSMA, de lui donner les moyens de s'acquitter convenablement de son mandat et de répondre à l'aspiration du peuple malien, aspiration sans laquelle ni la mission de l'ONU, ni les autres partenaires militaires internationaux et régionaux présents sur notre sol n'auront la crédibilité aux yeux de mes concitoyens. En termes clairs, les Nations Unies doivent aider le Mali à lutter efficacement contre la criminalité transfrontalière organisée afin d'asseoir les conditions véritables de sa stabilisation, gage de la réussite des actions de soutien politique, humanitaire, de développement et de protection des droits de l'homme. S'il est établi que la situation au Mali constitue une menace pour la paix et la sécurité internationale, il nous revient donc de trouver les voies et moyens idoines pour continuer à y faire face de manière holistique, solidaire et déterminée jusqu'à l'éradication de la dite menace. Monsieur le Président, dans la guerre sans merci qu'il mène contre le terrorisme, le gouvernement du Mali ne ménagera aucun effort pour remplir ses obligations internationales en termes de respect des droits de l'homme. Il accorde la plus haute importance à la coordination des actions de nos partenaires sur le terrain, à la coopération régionale pour tenir compte de la dimension régionale de la crise sécuritaire au Sahel. C'est tout le sens de notre engagement dans la force conjointe du G5 Sahel. C'est aussi tout le sens de notre demande commune au sein du G5 Sahel en faveur d'un mandat robuste et adapté sous le chapitre 7 de la Charte des Nations Unies et d'un financement prévisible et pérenne de la force conjointe du G5 Sahel. Dans un souci de cohérence et d'efficacité, le gouvernement s'attelle à la mise en place sous mon autorité d'une structure de suivi et de coordination des activités de l'aménagement, ainsi qu'à l'élaboration d'une stratégie de gestion intégrée de la crise au centre du Mali. Nous ne nous exonérons pas de nos responsabilités propres dans le processus de stabilisation du Mali. Le gouvernement de transition a une claire conscience que cette stabilisation passe aussi par la mise en œuvre de l'accord pour la paix et la réconciliation issu du processus d'Alger. Au demeurant, le gouvernement et les mouvements signataires, ainsi que ceux de l'inclusivité, poursuivent la mise en œuvre de l'accord dans un esprit de confiance et de responsabilité au sein d'un cadre nouveau appelé cadre intermalien pour la mise en œuvre de l'accord. Dans cet esprit, nous poursuivons la mise en œuvre intelligente et la relecture consensuelle de l'accord aux fins de son parachèvement. L'objectif recherché étant de favoriser son appropriation nationale et de renforcer son caractère inclusif tout en veillant aux conditions politiques et sociales du consensus nécessaire à la relecture de certaines dispositions conformément aux mécanismes prévus par l'accord. Concernant les questions de défense et de sécurité, un programme de désarmement, démobilisation et de réinsertion portant sur 3000 ex-combattants issus des mouvements signataires et de l'inclusivité a été mis en place, sur lesquels 1840 ex-combattants ont déjà été intégrés. Le gouvernement a également exprimé sa volonté d'intégrer 1160 restants au plus tard le 21 août 2021, n'eût été la lenteur accusée par la coordination des mouvements de l'Azawad dans la fourniture de la liste de ses représentants. Par ailleurs, le gouvernement du Mali est disposé à l'intégration prochaine des ex-combattants au sein des forces de sécurité, de la fonction publique de l'État et d'autres corps paramilitaires, dès que les quotas compatibles avec les capacités du budget national sont fixés. Le gouvernement est déterminé à surmonter les obstacles techniques qui émanent des autres parties à l'accord, en particulier des mouvements signataires dont l'adhésion au DDR doit être sans réserve. Le volet réinsertion socio-économique entamera les activités d'ici la fin du mois de septembre, avec l'appui de la MINUSMA et de la Banque mondiale. Je n'oublie pas ici la situation des réfugiés maliens dans les pays voisins et des personnes déplacées internes, qui reste une préoccupation majeure du gouvernement. Nous nous attellerons à créer, avec l'appui des partenaires bilatéraux et multilatéraux, les conditions idoines d'un retour de la sécurité et de la dignité de nos populations et à assurer leur participation aux prochaines élections. Monsieur le Président, la transition en cours au Mali se veut une transition de rupture qui porte l'espoir de guérir le Mali des maux qui l'assaillent, dont l'instabilité politique et institutionnelle, l'affaissement de l'État, conséquences directes de la corruption et de l'impunité. Pour réussir ce pari, notre pays a décidé de s'engager dans la voie des réformes qui constituent le deuxième axe du plan d'action du gouvernement. Ces réformes vont au-delà des questions politiques et institutionnelles et visent in fine à refonder l'État, dont le délitement progressif est à la base de l'extrême vulnérabilité du Mali face aux défis politiques, économiques et sociaux auxquels il est confronté. Mon pays souhaite être une solution aux crises qui menacent le Sahel. Le Mali aspire à vivre en paix avec ses voisins, à renforcer son unité, sa stabilité et recouvrer la plénitude de sa souveraineté sur tout son territoire. Le Mali veut garantir la sécurité humaine à l'intérieur de ses frontières en consolidant ses institutions constitutionnelles. À cette fin, le Mali est engagé à faire sa mue à travers les réformes, à amorcer sa transformation vers un État stable et prospère, orienté vers le bien-être de ses habitants. Ces réformes ont trop longtemps été différées, pour différentes raisons, par les différents régimes politiques qui sont succédés au pouvoir depuis 2 décennies. La transition en cours, sous la haute conduite de son Excellence le colonel Assimi Goïta, a décidé de s'y engager fermement. Le chef de l'État nous a commis à convoquer, dans les tout prochains jours, les assises nationales de la refondation, dont les recommandations auront force exécutoire aussi bien pour la période de transition en cours que pour la poursuite des politiques publiques à venir. Le troisième axe prioritaire du gouvernement est consacré à l'organisation des élections générales, transparentes, crédibles et inclusives, devant marquer le retour à l'ordre constitutionnel au Mali. Ces élections sont particulièrement importantes, car elles seront le baromètre de la réussite de la transition. Nous savons que leur qualité et leur crédibilité conditionneront l'avenir de notre démocratie, la légitimité et la solidité des institutions. Tirant les leçons de notre pratique démocratique récente, le gouvernement va instituer un organe unique indépendant de gestion des élections. Cet organe unique de gestion des élections posera les jalons politiques, juridiques et institutionnels de la restauration de la confiance des acteurs politiques et des citoyens lors des compétitions électorales. Il s'agit là d'une innovation majeure de nature à renforcer la démocratie et la légitimité des institutions. Nous avons conscience des délais impartis à la transition et de nos engagements internationaux. Nous travaillons sans relâche à les respecter. Dans cette optique, l'organe unique de gestion suivra un processus accéléré de mise en œuvre à travers la relecture de la loi électorale, l'installation d'un directoire national et des démembrements au niveau régional et local et dans les ambassades et consulats du Mali. À cet égard, la table ronde sur l'examen de l'avant-projet des termes de référence des Assises nationales de la refondation est ouverte hier à Bamako. Au-delà de la question de l'organe unique de gestion des élections, le gouvernement va s'atteler à réformer le système électoral à travers la relecture des textes fondamentaux régissant les élections. Enfin, Monsieur le Président, le quatrième axe de l'action gouvernementale consistera à instaurer la bonne gouvernance et l'adoption d'un pacte de stabilité. Sous ce chapitre, le gouvernement s'est engagé à assurer une gouvernance de rupture et d'exemplarité. Une lutte implacable est déjà engagée pour combattre la corruption et l'impunité qui sont à la base de la déliquescence de l'État. Les mesures en cours dans ce sens vont se poursuivre et s'intensifier. La gouvernance de rupture se traduit d'ores et déjà par une réduction drastique du train de vie de l'État afin de dégager des espaces budgétaires pour améliorer les conditions de vie des populations et assurer une répartition équitable des richesses nationales. Le président de la transition et le gouvernement ont déjà donné de bons exemples dans ce sens. Les ressources ainsi dégagées seront affectées vers les services sociaux de base. Pour plus de justice et d'équité entre les travailleurs, le gouvernement, après avoir procédé à l'harmonisation des grilles salariales au sein de la fonction publique, va initier dans les meilleurs délais une conférence sociale en concertation avec les partenaires sociaux et les acteurs du monde du travail. Monsieur le Président, pays sahélien à vocation essentiellement agricole, d'élevage et de pêche, le Mali demeure fortement préoccupé par les changements climatiques, qui constituent l'un des défis majeurs pour la survie et le développement de l'humanité. En effet, mon pays subit de plein fouet les effets du changement climatique, caractérisés par l'avancée et la désertification et son impact sur la faune et la flore, l'achèvement de nos fleuves et de nos cours d'eau, l'augmentation du niveau de chaleur, les inondations, etc., etc. C'est pourquoi je voudrais réaffirmer l'attachement du Mali à la mise en œuvre de l'accord de Paris sur le climat. Monsieur le Président, je voudrais conclure en rappelant que l'action du gouvernement de transition au Mali est orientée sur 3 piliers qui correspondent à 3 besoins vitaux pour le Mali. Il s'agit du besoin de sécurité, du besoin de justice pour lutter contre la corruption et l'impunité et du besoin de réforme, j'allais dire de refondation. Il est impérieux de continuer à travailler, à améliorer l'environnement de sécurité au Mali avec l'aide des amis du Mali, en appui aux efforts des forces de défense et de sécurité. Il est tout aussi impérieux de mener les réformes nécessaires à la refondation de l'État et à l'adaptation des textes régissant les élections aux besoins de la société malienne et aux évolutions du temps. Il n'y a pas d'alternative aux réformes que nécessite l'état désastreux du Mali si nous voulons faire en sorte que ce grand pays reste debout et redevienne stable. La CEDEAO a bien appréhendé cela et dès octobre 2018, elle avait recommandé à l'issue de sa mission d'information relative à la crise post-électorale de mener les réformes en ces termes, je cite, « Prenant acte de la prolongation de la législature actuelle, selon l'avis de la Cour constitutionnelle et au regard des dysfonctionnements largement reconnus et évoqués par tous les interlocuteurs lors du scrutin présidentiel passé, il est impératif que le gouvernement et tous les acteurs sociopolitiques se conviennent de manière consensuelle d'entreprendre des réformes courageuses des cadres légaux, y compris la Constitution de février 1992 et du système électoral, avant de s'engager dans les prochaines élections que compte mener le pays. Je dois dire que cette importante recommandation de CEDEAO n'a pas été suivie d'effet à ce jour. Le gouvernement de transition que j'ai l'honneur de diriger s'attelle à la mise en œuvre diligente de cette mesure. Je saisis cette occasion pour renouveler la gratitude du président de la transition, du gouvernement et du peuple malien, aux chefs d'État et de gouvernement de la CEDEAO pour leur leadership et pour leur présence constante aux côtés du Mali en ces moments difficiles et complexes. Nous les exhortons à continuer à avoir une lecture lucide de la situation qui prévaut au Mali, un pays vaste, ouvert sur cette frontière et qui constitue une digue pour toute la région ouest africaine. Je vous remercie de votre aimable attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier le Premier ministre et chef du gouvernement de la République du Mali de la locution qu'il vient de prononcer. Et je prie le protocole de bien vouloir accompagner son Excellence. Je donne maintenant la parole à l'observateur de l'État, observateur du Saint-Siège, pour qu'il introduise l'allocution du chef du gouvernement.
Mr. President, on this day, which coincidentally marks the 6th anniversary of Pope Francis' historic visit and address to this noble assembly, I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded video message of His Eminence Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State of His Holiness.
Mr. President, I am pleased to extend to you and all of the representatives of nations the warm greetings of Pope Francis. In his encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti on fraternity and social friendship, Pope Francis surveyed the many challenges facing the international community, such as war and conflict, mistreatment and violence, hunger and poverty, inequality and marginalization, individualism and mistrust, extremism and polarization, attacks on human dignity, the COVID-19 pandemic, and threats to the environment, among other dark clouds. To confront such difficulties effectively, we must approach them with renewed hope, based on the abundant seeds of goodness in our human family, like those heroically sown in response to the medical, social, economic, and spiritual dimensions of the pandemic. Such actions reveal, he indicated, that the medicine the world needs is not isolation and withdrawal into one's own interest, but rather fraternal closeness and hope grounded in the reserves of goodness present in human hearts. The theme of this general debate, Building Resilience Through Hope, focuses our attention on the crucial importance of hope in human affairs. Hope is different from optimism, which is an expectation that things will turn out well, or the idea that somehow history will inevitably develop on an upward trajectory. Instead, we know that our achievements are not unassailable. The maintenance of peace, the protection and promotion of human rights, the advance of integral human development, the care for our common home should never be taken for granted, but must be sought and secured by every generation. As new crises arise and others persist, we need hope to persevere in addressing them. Hope keeps us motivated when problems and disagreements seem unsolvable. It facilitates forgiveness, conscious that through reconciliation there can be a better future. It fosters resilience and inspires us to put in hard work even when we may not be able to see results achieved in our lifetime. For us Christians, hope is the most divine gift that can exist in the heart of mankind. It sees and loves what will be, in time and in eternity. Hope is expectation, fervent expectation, impassioned by the ultimate and definitive fulfillment of a mystery, that mystery of God's love. Mr. President, Pope Francis declared last year in his address to the General Assembly that we never emerge from a crisis just as we were. We come out either better or worse. To emerge better from the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to build on a renewed sense of fraternal solidarity. The pandemic has taught us how interconnected our world is, how every state has its own vulnerabilities, and that no state is capable of resolving the crisis on its own. Resilience demands that the international community put into action the commitments expressed during the special session of the General Assembly on COVID-19 last December. We must work together to remedy the situation of those who are on the pharmaceutical margins and to alleviate the needless suffering and death that they and so many others have and continue to endure. This is particularly the case with regard to vaccines, which must be available to everyone, especially in conflict areas and humanitarian settings. Resilience requires a renewed examination of how healthcare systems have largely been overwhelmed by the pandemic and left so many without sufficient care or any care at all. Even today, many have no access to testing, basic care, or vaccines, or even to the energy infrastructures that would make such care possible. Resilience calls for an examination of the fragility and shortfalls of our economic systems, which have left many behind as a result of the severe economic downturn and made the poor even more vulnerable. Finally, resilience involves perseverance in the fight against corruption, since the harm of corruption has become particularly exposed among the political and distribution failures of the pandemic. Mr. President, The pandemic has negatively impacted development programs and activities, as well the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. 5 years of progress on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals was halted, and in some cases reversed by the virus and its consequences, making sustainable development a reality by 2030, which 2 years ago appeared to be an uphill struggle with no certainty of success, has now become such a daunting challenge that tremendous efforts will be needed. To rebuild sustainably, we must rethink that the relationship between individuals and the economy, and ensure that both economic models and development programs remain at the service of men and women, particularly those on the margins of society, rather than exploiting both people and natural resources. Sustainable development, if truly at the service of the human person, must also incorporate the poor and their gifts and creativity as agents of their own integral development. We must unleash the promise and hope they embody for their good and the good of the entire human community. Mr. President, the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow is an important opportunity for resilience, as the international community has the chance to commit anew to the protection of our common home. We are compelled to strengthen our ambition, since we are presently experiencing the effects of decades of inaction in terms of the extreme flooding, drought, wildfires, melting glaciers, receding shorelines, malnutrition, and respiratory diseases that rising temperatures are precipitating. It is far past time to act. The tragic natural disasters that have struck our brothers and sisters in Haiti, a people already suffering from political and humanitarian challenges, is a clear call to the international community to work together in solidarity for a durable and sustainable development of which the people of Haiti may be the principal protagonist. Recent attention toward the environment has spawned great advances in technology, allowing us to provide for our needs sustainably. Human creativity and innovation in improving efficiency and decreasing the cost of clean energy are making environmentally conscious choices by governments and individuals easier. Such innovation, while spurring similar entrepreneurial creativity, also inspire hope. Mr. President, hope all too frequently is denied and remains elusive to so many women and men, boys and girls, because of another man-made threat to our common existence, namely war, conflict, and the possession and use of weapons of mass destruction. The scourge of war brings death and destruction, harms the environment, devastates communities, and so often traps regions and countries in a downward spiral. Sadly, we continue to witness the terrible impact of crises and conflicts across the globe. The recent aggravated humanitarian situation in Afghanistan and the ongoing political tensions in Syria and Lebanon, as well as in other places, are a stark reminder of the impact that conflicts press upon peoples and nations. The Holy See calls upon states to heed the call of the Secretary General and Pope Francis for a global ceasefire and a shared humanitarian responsibility. The damage to our fellow human beings and our planet is a special cause of concern with regard to nuclear arms and biological and chemical weapons. The threat of nuclear weapons possessed under the guise of nuclear deterrence creates an ethos of fear based on mutual annihilation and poisons a relationship between peoples, obstructs dialogue, and undermines hope. Humanitarian and security issues require us to end the nuclear arms race and to undertake effective measures toward nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and prohibition. The entry into force last January of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a major step forward. It is the firm hope of the Holy See that this will also spur progress in the implementation of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, scheduled to hold its review conference next January. Mr. President, Pope Francis considers one of the most serious causes for concern in today's world to be the crisis of human relationship, flowing from a way of life dominated by selfishness and by the culture of waste, where human values and the related transcendent dignity of the person are often trampled. This anthropological crisis is not a philosophical or academic dispute, but a crisis with enormous practical consequences for human rights. Our societies today are the theater of many injustices, where human beings are maltreated, exploited, ignored, killed, or left to languish in humanitarian emergencies. Women and girls, persons from different indigenous, racial, ethnic, and linguistic backgrounds experience violence and oppression or are reduced to second-class citizens. Far too often, humanitarian law is taken as a recommendation rather than an obligation by both state and non-state actors alike. Refugee, migrants, and internally displaced persons are increasingly left in limbo or even left to drown, unwelcome and unable to find a new home to raise their family in dignity, peace, and security. Religious believers endure harassment, persecution, death, and even genocides on account of their faith. The elderly and persons with disabilities are cast aside, especially when they are frail or considered burdensome. Innocent children are deemed problematic, discarded by society even before they are born, or have the chance to bring their own unique contribution into the world. The family, which the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes as the natural and fundamental group unit of society, is misrepresented. This is evident also in novel interpretation of existing human rights, separated from their underlying universal values. In many cases, new rights not only contradict the values they are supposed to support, but are imposed despite the absence of any objective foundation or international consensus. The Holy See believes that while depriving human rights of their original universal dimension, these new partial interpretations sadly become the ideological benchmark of spurious progress and another ground for polarization and division. Sadly, we are facing this in the constant pursuit of introducing controversial new agendas that drive UN processes contrary to the body's given mandates. In an age in which many universal human rights continue to be violated with impunity, these attempts in fact confuse, divert from implementing the human rights conventions, and impede the attention and energy that the promotion and protection of fundamental human rights and dignity deserve. We need to build resilience through hope and consensus in this noble institution, while defending human rights and fundamental freedoms including the right of life, to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and to freedom of opinion and expression, and not to undermine them. Mr. President, the resilience necessary to help the world emerge better from the various crises we face. The United Nations must constantly be renewed through returning with greater fidelity and resolve to the core principles and purposes enshrined in its charter. True revitalization means not just making structure and mechanisms more efficient, but assuring that the institution lives up to its true and commonly agreed upon aims, rather than becoming a tool of the powerful. The structural deficiencies that exist cannot be remedied either by sluggish solution or fast fixes, but require a commitment to what Pope Francis terms a healthy politics. The need for a healthy politics based on the pursuit of the common good and universal truth is particularly important at the Security Council, whose members are called to become the foremost artisans of peace throughout the world, constantly recommitting themselves to place international peace and rule of law above national interests or partisan ideologies. Far too often, the latter inevitably leads to gridlock, while the poorest and most vulnerable, who look to the Council for signs of hope, continue to suffer, pushed into greater despair. Revitalizing the United Nations must include examining whether the structure conceived in 1945 remains adequate for 2021 and beyond, as well as recognizing that from those states to whom more is given, more is to be expected, especially with regard to responsibility for the common good. In addition to the structural aspects of revitalization, greater attention must be given to promote and safeguard the mandates of UN entities and fora. The Holy See views with concern the push of some to break down the helpful division of labor among committees, commissions, meetings, and processes, turning all into bodies that focus on a limited number of disputed issues. Furthermore, the principle of consensus must be safeguarded. One common step in the right direction is preferable to many steps in different directions. To help the world build resilience through hope, the United Nations must lead by example, and the states, entities, and personnel that comprise the organization all have a key role to play in helping set that example. The Holy See is vigorously committed to playing its part. In conclusion, Mr. President, to recover, rebuild, respond, respect, and revitalize involves a rediscovery of resilience through firmly grounded hope. Many are the signs of hope, even in our weary societies. To be builders of peace in our societies means to find these seeds and shoots of fraternity. The God of the covenant asks us not to yield to separatism or partisan interest. He does not want to us ally ourselves with some at the expenses of others. Rather, he wants individuals and communities to be bridges of fellowship with all. Let us see, in the eyes of migrants and refugees, they are full of suffering and hope. Let us work together to give them the future to blossom in peace. In March, while the effects of the pandemic were still being very much felt, Pope Francis went to Iraq to encourage the Iraqi people in striving to give the world an example of resilience through hope. Visiting the birthplace of Abraham, to whom Jews, Christians, and Muslims all look as their father in faith, The Pope recalled the image of a storm-tossed sea to describe what is involved in building a culture of peace. It demands, he said, especially amid the tempest, that we row together and that no one be concerned simply for his own affairs. He continued, there will be no peace as long as we see others as them and not us. There will be no peace as long as our alliances are against others, for alliances of some against others only increase divisions. Peace does not demand winners or losers, but rather brothers and sisters who, for all the misunderstandings and hurts of the past, are journeying from conflict to unity. That is the way of hope which all of us should walk in this organization. Thank you, Mr. President.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Secretary of State of the Holy See for the statement just made. I now give the floor to His Excellency Demeke Mekonnen, Deputy Prime Minister of Ethiopia.
ክቡር ፕሬዝዳንት፣ ከሁሉ አስቀድሜ የ76ኛው የተባበሩ መንግስታት ድርጅት ጠቅላላ ጉባኤ ፕሬዝዳንት ሆነው በመመረጦ እርስዎንና እህት ሀገር ማልዲቭን እንኳን ደስ አላችሁ ለማለት እወዳለሁ። የ75ኛውን ጠቅላላ ጉባኤ ስርዓት በብቃት ለመሩት ለክቡር ቮልካን ቦስኪርም አድናቆቴን እገልጻለሁ። ከዚህ በተጨማሪም የተባበሩ መንግስታት ድርጅትን ለማገልገል ከፍተኛ በሆነ ድጋፍ በድጋሜ ለተመረጡት ዋና ጸሐፊ አንቶኒዮ ጉተሬዝም እንኳን ደስ አለዎት ለማለት ይሻለሁ። በዓለም አቀፍ ደረጃ የኮቪድ-19 ወረርሽኝ ስጋት በሆነበት ወቅት ተቀብሎ ላስተናገደን ሀገርም ምስጋና አቀርባለሁ። Mr. President, this year's General Assembly takes place while we continue to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic rattled all aspects of public and private life. It also revealed the power of innovation and the enormous potential of scientific research to serve humanity. I would like to take a moment to applaud the scientists, engineers, and everyone who have played a part in the discovery and rollout of COVID-19 vaccine. Evidently, science can serve humanity only if good faith and rationality guides politics. Unfortunately, Africa, with negligible vaccination rate, is left waiting for the drips from the surplus of others due to vaccine nationalism. In addition, the economic devastation in developing countries from the pandemic is yet to be addressed by meaningful economic and financial measures. We hope countries with the means would advance cooperation that is cognizant of the global nature of the problem. With this pandemic, there is no isolated safety. No one is safe until everyone is safe. Mr. President, the true dignity and freedom of people lies with their ability to sustain themselves. Poverty and dependence on foreign aid cause political, governance, security, and human development challenge. Global warming is the most alarming driver of poverty. agrarian and pastoralist communities and economies like ours with this livelihood face an existential challenge. The impact of climate change are destroying arable land and biodiversity, thereby disrupting our food system. Production of cash crops suffer from quality and quantity problems. Perennial flood and drought are straining the emergency readiness we have in place. The targets under the Environment and Sustainable Development Agenda are overdue and more be overtaken by events. Hopefully, COP26 will pave the way for climate financing and support to programs such as the Green Belt and Green Legacy afforestation initiatives that are restoring a long-lost ecosystem. Mr. President, in the past few years, we heard from this podium voice of justified concern and call for rule-based world order and viable multilateralism. Ethiopia has always been steadfast in its support for multilateral institutions. Our position emanates not from rhetoric, but from our tragic ordeal during the days rule-based order was left in the shambles. We commend the declaration of return and renewal of commitment to multilateralism. At the same time, we see a glaring need to reiterate the fundamental values of sovereign equality, non-interference, and cooperation based on mutual benefit and respect. Multilateralism stands on the shoulders of states that ably guard their sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Multilateralism will meet its objective only if states are able stand free to manage their domestic and external affairs. Indeed, our human aspirations are inherently similar. However, our viewpoints that are underpinned by our diversity in cultures, history, and socio-economic reality will not always be fully aligned. This diversity shall be viewed as an asset, and no one amongst us should wish to prevail over the other, especially when it comes to values and policies dealing with our internal and external affairs. Mr. President, 3 years ago, my country, Ethiopia, embarked on a promising journey of reform. The change we introduced ushered in democracy, human rights, human development, and regional stability. It also opened avenues for dialogue and unity among divergent political and interest groups. Tapping into Ethiopia's rich history and enormous potential, the reform chartered our inevitable and bright future, placing Ethiopia as a new horizon of hope. It overturned a complex network of corruption, illegitimate political power, and illicit financial flows installed at the cost of national interest and the determinant of regional peace. The reform, however, was not without challenge. As any other democracy, our democratic process is an attempt to find a balance between stability and disruption. In Ethiopia, groups that consider equality as subjugation are making their best effort to create and prolong anarchy. At the hands of these lords of instability, we went through unimaginably inhuman attacks against citizens, instigation of violence, and destruction of property that culminated in an attack against the Ethiopian army. On the night of November 4 last year, in a scheme orchestrated by a criminal group, the Ethiopian National Defense Force was attacked from within. The unsuspecting men and women in uniform were slain. The government of Ethiopia took the necessary measures to avert the grave danger imposed on us. Mr. President, while the government was addressing humanitarian needs, the disruptors applied their cruel design to aggravate human suffering. We were also caught by surprise and, to be honest, unprepared for the twisted propaganda campaign. Little did we know the power of privatized politics and foreign policy that clouds the truth from policy decisions. The criminal enterprise and its enablers created and advertised horrific imagery of faked incidents, as if the real misery of our people is not enough. Storylines are created to match not the facts, but preconceived stereotypical attitudes. The government of Ethiopia, meeting out its obligation to fulfill humanitarian needs, the declaration of humanitarian ceasefire, the commissioning of investigations, and accountability measures have not mitigated the propaganda campaigns. At this stage, we are nearly convinced humanitarian assistance is a pretext for advancing political considerations. Accused by agenda and revenue-driven media, convicted by misguided politics, we are now facing a unilateral coercive measure. Ethiopia opposed coercive measure when it was applied against others. We advised against its application on Ethiopia. Prescriptions and punitive measures never helped improve situations or relations. Mr. President, the prudent measures we will continue to take are commensurate with the existential challenges we face. Despite the undue pressure, we shall live up to the solemn obligation to preserve sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the political independence of Ethiopia. While cooperation and concern from our friends is welcome, we underline the need to employ constructive approach, cultivate trust, and create understanding. Attempts to extend support or even opine on an internal issue of a state requires full understanding about the complexity of the problem. It shall be noted the challenge we are facing is not limited to the boundaries of Ethiopia. The entire region is facing the destructive path paved for it by this group. Supporting Ethiopia overcome this criminal group is helping sustain regional peace. Dialogue has always been our preferred course of action. Accordingly, Ethiopia is open to candid initiatives for peace. In this connection, we will work with the African Union and the High Representative for the Horn of Africa towards an Ethiopia-led national dialogue. We only hope the African Union will be given the space to apply its own wisdom. I also underscore my government's unreserved commitment for the provision of humanitarian assistance and facilitate the operation of our humanitarian partners that adhere to the principle of neutrality, independence, and humanity, and the laws of the country. Apart from this, no excuse will justify any attempt to intervene in our internal affairs. Mr. President, had it been for the plan of the internal and external destabilizers, Ethiopia would have turned into rebels where the greedy and the archaic feast and thrive. Not only that, the political map of the Horn of Africa would have altered, worsening its existing volatility. With the resilience of its people and the foundational cultural and religious diversity that made up of Ethiopian society, Ethiopia will continue overcoming its adversaries. Ethiopia will always be a beacon of freedom and symbol of peace. As a nation that had never posed threat to security of other states, we will maintain our support to regional and global stability. At this historic juncture, Ethiopia demands and Ethiopia deserves a similar cooperation it extended to others in the aftermath of attacks targeting their institutions. Mr. President, the political and security landscape in Africa is on a path of adversity. Forcible overthrow of governments, joint military exercise, aggression, renewed appetite for intervention in sovereign countries, subversion and mercenarism, normalized and renewed scramble for natural resource, secret military pacts, geopolitical competitions, and others are becoming pervasive. Unless we swiftly change course, this will be yet another round to destabilize Africa and disenfranchise Africans in the determination of our destiny. We hope there will be more countries to lift the banner of multilateralism rather than the vagaries of unilateralism. Accordingly, Ethiopia stands ready to avail bilateral mechanisms and diplomatic solutions to resolve the border dispute with Sudan. It is incumbent upon our two governments to work for peace for the sake of our people that have the strongest bond of fraternity. Mr. President, the past year has also seen a milestone for the people of Ethiopia. Our experiment with democracy ascended one level with a free, fair, peaceful, and credible election with an unprecedented level of voter turnout. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a hydroelectric dam project we fully financed, underwent a second-year filling. Hopefully, we inspired others to develop local capability to plan, finance, and complete renewable energy projects. However, our humble attempt to light the house of millions of Ethiopians and create hope for our youth is politicized before global bodies. These people's project also received unending threats. Ironically, we are accused and threatened for drinking from our water. On the matter of the Nile and the GERD, our confidence is in the might of the truth, wisdom, and justice that has always defined our path for cooperation. The generational desire to use our natural resource will not be stopped by a colonial legacy and monopolistic cause. We hope our negotiating partners are prepared for a win-win outcome under the African-led process. Mr. President, I would like to conclude my statement with a very important note on the role of my country in peacekeeping. Our troops successfully completed missions in Darfur and Abyei. They paid the ultimate sacrifice in the most isolated mission areas, facing active intercommunal clashes, unconventional warfare methods, border disputes, and unabated administrative obstructions. Our troops have done justice to the most cherished name of their country through their service and sacrifice. I pay them my respects and express our pride. With the impending transition of the peacekeeping mission in Abyei, I would like to convey our best wishes for our two neighbors to amicably resolve their territorial disputes. We hope the sacrifice we made will not be in vain. I thank you, Mr. President, and assure you of Ethiopia's full support for successful completion of your presidency of hope. Thank you. አመሰግናለሁ።
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister of Ethiopia for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Dominique Hasler, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Education and Sport of Liechtenstein.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate you on your election to the helm of the General Assembly, the most important policy-making body in the world. The future must be shaped by the best ideas, not the loudest voices, and by those who are committed to the purposes and principles of this organization. Small states have always had an intrinsic understanding of that, and I'm deeply convinced of the value added that states like ours bring to the United Nations and to the work of this Assembly in particular. Mr. President, I wish to address the plight of the people of Afghanistan, given the immense humanitarian tragedy that has been unfolding in the country in the last few weeks. We pay tribute to all those who have worked bravely and with conviction towards a peaceful and safe future for the country. In particular, the women and girls who have been fighting for the full enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. We call upon those who effectively exercise control to fully respect their rights and freedoms, especially the rights to quality education and work, as well as freedom of movement. The people of Afghanistan live now in a very precarious position, and they are looking at us and at the United Nations as an organization to support them. We will continue to stand with them, call for the full respect of their human rights and fundamental freedoms, and ask that the United Nations lives up to its historic responsibility in this terrible and dangerous crisis of humanitarian security. Mr. President, as we gather in the General Assembly Hall, the symbol of multilateralism and the sovereign equality of states, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to loom large. We are meeting under restricted and difficult circumstances here in New York. Our way of living together across the globe is heavily affected, as are our lives as individuals. The pandemic knows no geographic boundaries. We all know that we can only be successful if we work together. Solidarity is simply also a matter of self-interest. Yet, the pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities, both within and among societies. Women and children and those in economically weak positions have been hit hardest. Time and again, we have been saying that ensuring access to vaccination for all is the only way to protect ourselves from the pandemic. And yet, we continue falling short of reaching this goal. Liechtenstein will continue to invest in the United Nations system, to play a key role in addressing the ongoing pandemic, in helping us prepare better for future ones, and ideally in preventing them altogether. 18 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, we are still uncertain where we stand and must be prepared for setbacks. And this in spite of the fact that the scientific community has responded at impressive speed and developed an effective vaccine in record time. Globally, the support for COVAX, to which Liechtenstein has also made its contribution, has so far been not sufficient to bring about access to vaccine to all. This is not just an obligation vis-à-vis those who are in economically disadvantaged positions, but also in the investment we all need to make. Mr. President, the pandemic has brought home forcefully the need us to take decisive action, and to do so with the highest sense of urgency. First among the challenges facing us is the ever more dramatic climate crisis. Both the climate change-related catastrophes of the past month and the most recent report of the International Panel on Climate Change make it brutally clear that we have very little time left to reverse the downward spiral and to meet our obligations to future generations, to humankind as a whole. We are heartened by the return to a comprehensive multilateralist approach, evidenced by the enhanced support for the Paris Climate Agreement. This is, of course, just the bare minimum required for us to make progress together and to do so quickly. We are looking at those whose engagement is indispensable for us to turn the tide. But the Liechtenstein government is also strongly committed to do its part to help preserve a livable and healthy planet for future generations, knowing that our people, in particular our youth, expect us to be ambitious and decisive. We are proud to lead the world on solar power per capita and take this as an encouragement to increase sustainability in other areas too. The upcoming COP26 in Glasgow is the ultimate test for our collective resolve. I sincerely hope that we will be able to pass it together. For the Glasgow meeting to be a success, it must bring a true breakthrough and a paradigm shift in the prevailing dynamic which is playing for time that we all know we do not have. Mr. President, climate actions stands out among the Sustainable Development Goals, reflected in the 2030 Agenda, the biggest standard-setting agreement of the United Nations in its recent history. But it is rightly part of the comprehensive agenda we have set for ourselves. Environmental, social, and corporate governance have taken a key place in the discussion on policy making as well as in the private sector. Finance against slavery and trafficking, one of Liechtenstein's key SDG projects, places a strong emphasis on the social and corporate governance dimension. Fast is a public-private partnership embedded in the UN system, places financial institutions as the heart of the fight against modern slavery and human trafficking. In the areas of compliance, responsible investment, and financial innovation. Having achieved much more than we had hoped for, FAST is expanding its reach in the effort to work for dissemination and implementation. Enhancing partnerships for FAST will remain a key objective of Liechtenstein's engagement for the 2030 agenda. Mr. President, since its very inception, the United Nations has stood for the rule of law, the belief in the necessity for international law to govern the relations between states, but also between states and individuals. State institutions must be accountable and inclusive. We all have agreed to that in the SDGs. At the same time, people have a fundamental right to participate in decision-making processes, either directly or through free and fair election of their representation. This is the principal tenet of democracy, that Liechtenstein will defend against authoritarian tendencies and promote as a safeguard against the abuse of power, also against the background of the 100th anniversary of our Constitution. A look at many of the crisis situations around the world illustrate clearly the need for accountability, of which international criminal justice is an indispensable part. Be it the over a decade-long armed conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic, or the universally condemned coup in Myanmar by an unaccountable military regime. The prevalence of impunity not only leads to new atrocity crimes, but it also makes sustainable peace and thus development impossible. In the era of international criminal justice, the International Criminal Court continues to be the key institution. The ICC deserves our full support, and I am proud that Liechtenstein has been a consistent advocate for the court since the very beginning. We will continue that important work for victims and survivors, for the rule of law and democracy, for the atrocities that the ICC's very existence has deterred and will deter in the future. I am encouraged by the developments in the Sudan, which illustrate in the clearest possible way two things. First, justice may be a long time coming, especially for those in the most powerful positions. And second, justice is a key ingredient for any society to turn the page on a dark past and move forward with hope. Legitimacy and the full support both of its own people and of the international community. Both these aspects have also driven our initiative to create the IIIM for Syria, which has boosted the principle of universal jurisdiction and until today represents the most concrete pathway to justice for the Syrian people. Mr. President, when we talk about enhancing institutions and the rule of law, we have to start at our own doorstep. The drafters of the United Nations Charter have shown great vision and leadership in setting principles for a peaceful and prosperous world, where the rule of law and individual freedom prevails, peoples determine their own fate, and disputes are solved amicably. They are as valid and pertinent as 76 years ago. Unfortunately, the practices and processes of the United Nations do not always lend themselves to implement these principles. we often find ourselves in a situation where our actions or lack therefore are in clear conflict with those principles. Such situations include massive violations of international law, especially the law of war and human rights. The very fabric of our rules-based international order, while the political bodies of the United Nations remain silent. Mr. President, this Assembly must take responsibility and step forward in such situations, as it has done in the past at times. The General Assembly should also convene as a matter of course in each and every case when the Security Council action has been blocked by a veto. Liechtenstein will pursue this idea with interested states as one concrete contribution to enhance accountability in the institutions of the United Nations. There are, of course, many more areas in urgent need of reform, in particular the Security Council, and Liechtenstein will continue to make its independent voice heard where needed. We also look forward to an energized second term in office of Secretary General Guterres, in service of an inclusive, powerful, and effective multilateralism and our common agenda. We should aspire to deliver on this basis by building the 6 bridges the Secretary General has identified for all of us and the peoples of the world. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Education and Sports of Liechtenstein for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Vivian Balakrishnan, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Singapore.
Mr. President, Excellencies, friends and colleagues, let me start by congratulating His Excellency Abdullah Shahid on assuming the presidency of the 76th session of the General Assembly. I also thank His Excellency Volkan Bozkır for his leadership of the 75th session during an unprecedented and difficult year. The most important lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic is that multilateral cooperation is absolutely essential to overcome the challenges of our global commons. And only coordinated international action can lead us to a sustainable and inclusive and resilient recovery. And this is precisely why the role of the United Nations is so crucial, especially for small and developing countries. The UN must empower countries to deal with the challenges of managing our global commons in order to build a more resilient future. I want to welcome and commend the leadership of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, not only for his achievements over the past term, but in putting forth a bold and visionary common agenda to reposition and to adapt the United Nations for the future. In particular, I welcome his proposal for a summit of the future to forge a global consensus. Today, I wish to highlight 4 key areas that require our urgent attention: public health, climate change, the oceans, and the digital revolution. First, the fight against COVID-19 is far from over. access to vaccines remains the biggest problem faced by many countries. Our immediate priority must be to redouble efforts to expand access to vaccines by scaling up production and distribution. Singapore is a strong supporter of vaccine multilateralism. We will continue to support the COVAX facility, and Singapore will donate our vaccines under the COVAX initiative to other countries with greater needs. We have continued to help our friends and our neighbors where we can, through other contributions of medical supplies, oxygen, and equipment. And as a transshipment hub, Singapore has always played our part to keep essential supplies moving to where they are needed most. In the longer term, we need to take forward the recommendations of the G20 High-Level Independent Panel to address the major gaps in preparedness for future pandemics. We need to strengthen the multilateral support for the WHO and the UN, and to mobilize resources for our collective security, because no one is safe until everyone is safe. And this brings me to my second point. We need a sustained and ambitious global response to address climate change. The effects of climate change are deeply felt at a local level, but the solution will depend on a collective response at a global level. For a small island city-state like Singapore, climate change remains a clear and present danger. And recent extreme weather events are stark reminders that we do not have time to lose. The IPCC's recent landmark report has concluded that global temperatures are likely to rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius within the next 2 decades. And we are likely to see more intense rainfall, flooding, droughts, the loss of sea ice, and rising sea levels. The fight against climate change will be a stark litmus test of our ability to manage the global commons through multilateral action. No country acting alone can move the needle. But if we work together, we can make a substantial impact. If we fail, the consequences will be calamitous for every country and for all humanity. Singapore has always been a strong advocate of the Paris Agreement from the very beginning. Last year, even whilst battling the pandemic, we submitted our enhanced 2030 nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement and our long-term low emissions development strategy for 2050 and beyond. This year, we unveiled the Singapore Green Plan 2030, which outlines a whole-of-nation approach to sustainable development and charts ambitious, concrete targets over the next 10 years. Amongst others, we will plant 1 million more trees on our tiny island. We will quadruple solar energy deployments, and we will reduce the waste sent to landfills. We are also committed to working with our partners in new areas, including green finance and clean energy solutions. And we look forward to substantive outcomes at the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, in Glasgow. The third global commons in urgent need of multilateral action are our oceans. The oceans sustain our global ecosystem. They are a repository of biodiversity and a buffer for climate change. They are also a critical artery for trade and a source of jobs and livelihood for billions of people. As a tiny island state at the confluence of key global shipping routes, heavily dependent on maritime trade, Singapore, therefore, is an ardent advocate of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS for short. UNCLOS is the foundation for a rules-based governance of the oceans in all aspects. It sets the rules for maritime entitlements and provides the overarching framework for the peaceful resolution of maritime disputes. It is fundamental for maintaining open trade routes and sea lines of communication. The 40th anniversary of the adoption of UNCLOS next year is an opportunity for us to reaffirm our commitment to UNCLOS as the primary legal instrument for oceans governance. And we need to do more to ensure its effective implementation. Singapore also firmly believes in the importance of conserving and ensuring the sustainability of our marine environment. So we look forward to the 4th session of the BBNJ Intergovernmental Conference next year and to the 2nd UN Ocean Conference to be co-hosted by Kenya and Portugal next year. The 4th area for urgent multilateral action relates to the digital revolution and its impact on sustainable development. The digital revolution was well underway before COVID-19 erupted, but the pandemic has accelerated the pace and the scale of this ongoing revolution. Digital technologies have empowered millions of people, but actually the gulf of opportunities between the digital haves and the digital have-nots has actually widened. Today, 3.8 billion people remain digitally disconnected. And this digital divide has prevented access to education, to healthcare, and to many other essential services for millions of people around the world. Digital transformation is not just about new technologies or new hardware. Fundamentally, it must be about improving lives, empowering people, and especially the poorest and the most vulnerable. It is about strengthening the resilience of our societies and economies. And in a nutshell, digital transformation should be about sustainable development. To put it differently, if we do not close the digital divide, we will not achieve the sustainable development goals. And this is why digitalization poses a global challenge, and it requires a concerted global response. There are many questions related to this transformation. How can we provide fair and secure access to digital data so that the data is not monopolized by a few and leaving the vast majority digitally disenfranchised? How can we encourage a freer flow of data across the world to promote innovation and inclusive sustainable development? Can we find ways to address the pandemic of misinformation, which sometimes arguably has been worse than the pandemic itself? There are no easy, ready answers, but we clearly do need to have a conversation about a global framework to maximize these opportunities and to deal with the challenges posed by the digital revolution. The goal is both simple and singular. How can we enhance multilateral cooperation to leverage digital technologies for sustainable development? There are many paths that we can take. The Secretary General's proposal for a global digital compact, or perhaps a new UN Convention on Digital Transformation for Sustainable Development, or a framework of norms and principles. I leave these options on the table to be part of a conversation that we all need to have at a global level. As a tiny country, as a vital node in the international digital network, Singapore has always advocated a global architecture that is open, inclusive, interoperable, and multi-stakeholder. Such a global digital architecture must be shaped by a few guiding principles. One, the voices of small states must be heard, and our concerns taken into account. Two, digital transformation needs to be people-focused and it must improve people's daily lives. 3, we need to involve all relevant stakeholders, the government, the private sector, civil society, because it is no longer possible in today's digital world to neatly draw lines between government, industry, and citizens. 4th, we need to think digital, which means thinking in an integrated, multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral way. The complex problems of today and tomorrow require innovative solutions. And 5, we need concrete action through identifying a common set of digital development goals and a framework for multilateral cooperation. At the national level, Singapore is already building partnerships with many countries. We have concluded digital economy agreements with several of our partners. We co-lead the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce with Japan and Australia. And this now includes more than 80 member economies and comprise 90% of global trade. These can be building blocks in a larger global architecture. At the broader level, we need determined action to close the digital divide, not only within nations, but also between nations. There is already much work being done, but we need to give these efforts a stronger push through education, training, and improving the digital skills and literacy of our people across the board, investing in infrastructure for universal and affordable internet connectivity, and expanding access to data and digital public goods, including open source software and digital utilities. We can do a lot more to improve international data governance, to promote interoperability, trust, security, when we transact in the digital environment. I've only touched on some of these issues that I believe we need to look at. There are other important issues outlined in the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation, and the common agenda that he has set out lays out a way forward on a global digital technology track. The next step is to take action on these proposals, and Singapore will support the efforts by the United Nations to advance our global conversation, so that together we can make tangible progress on digital transformation for sustainable development. Mr. President, Excellencies, as we seek to build a more inclusive, sustainable future, we need to give each other a hand. And this is especially so for small and developing countries. In 1992, Singapore established the Forum of Small States, FOSS, F-O-S-S. It's an informal platform for small states to discuss issues of mutual concern. We started off with a group of 16. It has now grown to 108 members at the United Nations. And we will celebrate our 30th anniversary next year. To mark this milestone, Singapore will launch a new Force for Good program. It will commence in 2022. It will focus on priority areas such as the digital transformation and COVID-19 recovery, customized to the unique challenges faced by small countries. Because we believe it is only by working in partnership, by helping each other, that we can reach a more resilient, a more inclusive, and a more sustainable tomorrow. It's always darkest before dawn, but dawn will arrive. There is hope, and there's much work ahead for all of us. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Singapore for his statement. We have heard the last speaker in the general debate for this meeting. We will continue the general debate on Monday, 27th of September at 9 a.m. in this hall. The exercise of the right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and to 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. I call on the representative of Indonesia.
Madam President, I'm taking the floor to exercise Indonesia's rights of reply to the statement made by Vanuatu. I'm appalled that Vanuatu keeps using this august forum to infringe the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other member states and continues its ill-intentioned and politically motivated aggression against Indonesia. We strongly reject false, baseless allegation and misrepresentation that continues to be nurtured by Vanuatu. They create false and empty hopes and fuel conflicts, sadly, at the expense of innocent lives. Vanuatu tries to impress the world with its so-called concern for human rights issues. In reality, their version of human rights is twisted and fails to mention inhumane and heinous acts of terror committed by armed separatist criminal groups. Vanuatu deliberately closed its eyes when these armed separatist criminal groups murdered nurses, healthcare workers, teachers, construction workers, and law enforcement apparatus. These are the peoples who actually dedicate their lives for the Papuans. When innocent construction workers were brutally murdered, why did Vanuatu choose to be silent? When teachers were mercilessly slain and killed, why did Vanuatu choose to be silent? When public facilities built for the people of Papua were destroyed, why did Vanuatu, once again, choose to remain silent? In fact, Vanuatu is advocating separatism under the guise of artificial human rights concern. Is this their understanding of human rights? Vanuatu has repeatedly tried to question the unquestionable status of Papua as an integral state, as an integral part of Indonesia. This violates the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and contravenes the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relation and cooperation among states. We cannot let this repeated offense against the UN Charter continue in this forum. Madam President, Indonesia is a pluralistic country with vibrant democracy and respect for rule of law, good governance, and social justice. And we live up to our commitment to promoting and protecting human rights. Democracy, rule of law, good governance, and social justice are all vital components in the quest for human rights. All our citizens are treated as equal, regardless of his or her sociocultural, religious, or economic background. Open your eyes. See the whole picture. see everything, or you will be lost. I thank you, Madam President.
We will continue the general debate on Monday, 27 September at 9 a.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.
Statement just made. I now give the floor, Excellencies, my dear colleagues, to the representative of Jamaica to introduce an address by the head of government.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, it is my great pleasure and distinct honor to introduce to you Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, who will deliver a pre-recorded statement. Thank you.
Your Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, I extend warm congratulations on your election to the presidency of this 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I also commend your predecessor, His Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, for his work during the historic 75th anniversary, a particularly difficult year for the United Nations and its membership as we grappled with the insidious COVID-19 pandemic. Your Excellency, you can be confident of Jamaica's continued commitment to collaborate and seek viable solutions for persistent global challenges, most notably the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We must take a fresh look at how we rebuild sustainably, attain the Sustainable Development Goals, and renew our focus on social justice and climate action. Mr. President, the theme for this year's debate, with its emphasis on building resilience, is welcomed as the world searches for ways to manage the COVID-19 pandemic with its dreadful impacts on all aspects of human existence. We must inspire hope to drive our emergence from the scourge of this pandemic better and stronger than we were before. Mr. President, at the core of building resilience is restoring the health and well-being of our people. The pandemic has exacerbated challenges in this area, especially for small island developing states like Jamaica, which already face limited resources in our health sector. Most regrettably, many lives have been lost, and we extend our condolences. There are increasing uncertainties as the pandemic continues and new variants emerge. While mitigation efforts to help to reduce transmission and mortality remain crucial, the long-term solution must be vaccines that are accessible to all. We know that vaccines only work if a critical threshold is attained. Sharing vaccines in a strategic manner serves the global common good, as no country will be safe until all are safe. Jamaica supports a globally coordinated approach to the scaling up of production and equitable distribution of vaccines with the United Nations at the core. We welcome the support received from bilateral and international partners and through the COVAX facility. COVAX was conceived as an expression of multilateralism bringing widespread aspiration of hope in the collective approach. While COVAX has not met all expectations, nevertheless, we believe in the essential merits of the facility and call for urgent, increased international collaboration to avoid the widening gap in recovery across countries and regions. Mr. President, today we see some countries receiving a digital dividend, while others suffer the consequences of a digital divide. There is need to urgently address this digital divide in COVID-19 adaptation measures, responses, and recovery efforts. Accelerated digitalization, remote work and education, e-commerce, and the virtual delivery of essential services have allowed the digitally connected to thrive while exacerbating the inequalities faced by the digitally disconnected. This is particularly evident in our rural areas, along gender lines, and generally among the poorest and most vulnerable. Addressing these negative consequences of the digital divide will require greater engagement of the public and private sectors in building foundations for long-term development. Leaving no one behind today means leaving no one offline. That is why Jamaica has been working to ensure that the tools needed to adapt and thrive are provided to our citizens. Mr. President, the COVID-19 pandemic has also spurred innovation and new forms of collaboration across sectors. We are committed to the development of a sustainable framework to ensure the availability of human capital to meet the growing, changing needs of the economy. Jamaica is taking an inclusive approach to improve digital literacy through increased access to and use of ICT by 50% in public institutions, schools, and key public areas in the country over the next 4 years. We are engaging our private sector to improve the application of science, technology, and innovation in educational institutions towards national development. We believe that countries should be supported in their efforts to build robust and resilient digital infrastructure. Public investments of this sort can serve as a force multiplier in narrowing the gaps that result in inequitable development outcomes. Universal, secure, and affordable digital connectivity is needed to ensure inclusive and sustainable development. We, therefore, advocate for an increased digital alliance within the global community and support the UN Secretary-General's high-level panel on the Digital Cooperation Roadmap. Mr. President, the multiple challenges associated with the COVID-19 pandemic have placed severe pressure on our fiscal accounts, threatening our hard-won macroeconomic stability. The pandemic has demonstrated how quickly our development gains can be eroded, and that much more needs to be done by the international community to secure a resilient future for the most vulnerable. We must retain hope in our ability to meet the targets for the SDGs, even with adjusted timelines. Mr. President, last year, along with the Prime Minister of Canada and the UN Secretary-General and other heads of state and government and key international partners, I convened the Financing for Development in the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond initiative. The outcome was ambitious, yet practical, with policy options to support COVID-19 response and recovery for consideration by the international community. It now remains for us to take action. Mr. President, for Jamaica, we anticipate real GDP recovery within 4 years, given the relative strength of our economy and the stimulus packages implemented both locally and internationally. However, we will require adequate fiscal space and funding to achieve the SDGs and to be able to respond and recover from the health, social, and economic implications of the pandemic in light of high debt servicing requirements. The continued use of measures of development which do not take into account the full spectrum of vulnerabilities of small island developing states is a major impediment to our efforts to attain the SDGs. We who live in one of the most disaster-prone regions of the world are more vulnerable than our income data suggests. We reiterate today that consideration of our development level must be linked to our socio-economic and environmental vulnerability. This rationale underpins the basis for a multidimensional vulnerability index for small island developing states and for the ongoing work by the UN on this matter, as endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly last year. Mr. President, the Caribbean Development Bank has reported that small island developing states' debts have risen to unsustainable levels since the pandemic. The number of Caribbean countries with a debt to GDP ratio above 60% has increased from 9 to 13, with the average debt to GDP ratio increasing to 85%. Jamaica maintains its call for a revision of the graduation criteria, as the classification system utilized by international financial institutions is simply not appropriate. We concur with the UN Secretary General in his assessment that graduation must be a reward, not a punishment. As we strive to build forward stronger in this decade of action, we call for the commitment of the international community to a post-COVID reality that guarantees greater investment and financing to support development and economic growth in small island developing states. We also seek the reorientation of the international financial system to align financing with sustainable development to accelerate our push to achieve our SDG goals. Mr. President, climate change remains one of the defining global challenges of our era and of even greater concern for future generations. Our ability to achieve sustainable development will be compromised if we do not find real solutions to the ongoing climate emergency. The demand for climate adaptation is increasing, but so is the fear that it will be unmet. A more worrisome truth is the IPCC's finding that human influence on the Earth's climate has already led to unprecedented and irreversible changes. In their efforts to combat these changes, small island developing states have been unable to access climate finance at the pace and scale necessary. We have instead been forced to spend significant funds on loss and damage, with limited financial support from large emitters. Jamaica joins with all small island developing states in calling for the delivery of the $100 billion per annum committed in 2015 by the international donor community. COP26 must deliver significant progress on the priority issues of climate financing, loss and damage, adaptation and mitigation, as well as the development of effective climate change plans. Mr. President, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea recognizes the ocean as a common heritage of mankind. As the science and the research have shown, we must also see the oceans as playing a vital role as a climate mitigator. We support the development of a legally binding international instrument on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. We look forward to the successful conclusion of negotiations for an international treaty under the Convention in 2022. Mr. President, we reaffirm the importance of multilateral approaches to the issues of peace and development and the central role of the United Nations in their treatment. We support the resolution of disputes, whether in the Middle East, in the Caribbean, or elsewhere, through dialogue and negotiated settlements. We call for an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Mr. President, the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons remains a daily challenge to citizen security and a grave concern to Jamaica. The widespread availability of these arms and their ammunition is a key enabler of conflict and endemic crime and represent a significant danger to our internal security, fostering criminal activities which destabilize the social order. We will work with all our partners to enhance the capacity of member states to address issues related to arms control and disarmament by preventing the diversion of conventional arms to the illicit market. This matter remains a priority for Jamaica as we seek the assistance of our bilateral, regional, and international partners in addressing this issue. President, the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations recognized the pivotal role of the organization, to which we continue to assign new mandates and challenges. Let us, with equal fervor, resolve to equip the organization with the necessary tools and financial resources to enable it to effectively undertake its leadership role in safeguarding international peace and security and in ensuring the economic and social well-being of mankind. Our common vision must be one in which the UN can act and will act as a catalyst for hope, for change, for peace, and as an instrument of progress on behalf of all peoples of the world. I thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister, Minister of Defence, Economic Growth and Job Creation of Jamaica for the statement just made. The Assembly, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, will now hear an address by His Excellency John Briceño, Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Economic Development and Investment of Belize.
The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency James Marape, Prime Minister and Minister for Bougainville Affairs of the independent state of Papua New Guinea. May I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I have great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency James Marape, Prime Minister and Minister for Bougainville Affairs of the independent state of Papua New Guinea. I invite him to address the General Assembly.
His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid, the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, United Nations Secretary General, fellow leaders, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinguished honor and pleasure on my own behalf and that of my 8 million plus people and government to join other global leaders in addressing the General Assembly today. I also take this time to extend our condolences to the families in your countries, including my own country, who have lost loved ones due to COVID-19, and our get well wishes to those who are sick. I also pay tribute to the global frontline workers and service personnel who have toiled over and beyond the call of duties to care for those who are sick and vulnerable, especially our medical workers. Mr. President, this being my first attendance at this global forum, I am greatly humbled and warmly congratulate you and the government and people of the Republic of Maldives on your mandate, particularly as a small island developing state, to lead our collective work this session. This is compounded by the intensifying and worrisome global climate crisis, accelerated by biodiversity losses and other humanitarian, peace, security, and trade-related issues that poses great challenges to the way we now manage our regional and global and socio-economic affairs. Despite all these challenges, we are heartened by your foresight, commitment, and leadership under your Presidency of Hope, Vision and TEM. We pledge our total support to you and offer our partnership during your tenureship as President of this August Forum. Mr. President, I also thank your predecessor, His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, and the delegation of Turkey for his excellent leadership and outstanding work this past year, under, of course, very challenging circumstances. We wish him and his family all the very best. I want to place on record Papua New Guinea's deep appreciation and support to our friend, the Secretary General of United Nations, His Excellency Guterres, for his continuing bold and decisive leadership of work for our United Nations in as far as the United Nations mandate and charter is concerned. Mr. Secretary General, your unanimous reappointment for another term starting next year is indeed a clear demonstration of the confidence and trust the United Nations member states, including my own country, have in your work ethics, your strong leadership, which this organization needs at this very challenging period. I thank you for your frank and sobering assessment of the challenges before us and your proposals on how we confront these challenges practically and at multilateral levels. Mr. President, I bring to you all greetings from Papua New Guinea in the blue, peaceful Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean, or the blue Pacific continent, is home to marine and terrestrial biodiversity and is where the most vulnerable small island states are being exposed to the global threats of rise in sea level due to climate change and the health and the associated economic woes brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. I speak for Papua New Guinea, of course, but the issues will no doubt resonate with the small island states, including those of my Pacific brothers and sisters. I also believe, Mr. President, that you too will have some appreciation on what these issues are, because you come from a small island state yourself. Our ocean homes and our way of life is intertwined with the coastal ecosystem in its natural equilibrium. This equilibrium is now affected by human influence, and for us small island states, not in our making. But we are the first victims and the most affected because of our inherent vulnerabilities. Mr. President, as we convene and continue to speak on climate change in the ambiences of our 21st century, post-halls like this August United Nations Assembly, may I remind us all that little children and their families who are living in the seas of earth are living in fear and uncertainty of what their future will be like. This is because in their lifetime they have seen their arable and safe lands lost due to sea level rise and are watching as the structures that their lives are built upon slips away. It is time the big carbon emitters of planet Earth own up and apologize to small island states and all other victims of climate change. And I make this statement with no apologies. And today I make a call for all of us, and especially to the big carbon emitting nations who are now enjoying their national economic transformations through industrialization, to pause, think, and take responsibility to save our planet. I am comforted by the recent commitment by President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson on the respective nations' intention to respond better to tackling climate change issues. Mr. President, I also hear of China's positive response and note that it is good we are now uniting to save our planet. We have a collective responsibility to take actions to save Earth. Mr. President, when astronaut Neil Armstrong walked on Moon on July 20, 1969, he would have looked back to the direction where he came from. and I assume that he would not have seen his beloved home state, the United States of America. He would have seen his home planet, planet Earth. It is the survival of Earth that we must now take action. I want to make this statement: enough of talk. We have to take actions commensurate to the volume of emissions from our industries. Leaders of the big carbon-emitting nations must now lead the global effort in rebalancing the environmental equilibrium. It is a hard ask, but really a necessary call for leadership and champions. I point to all nations on earth to embrace the unity of humanity to save our planet, because what happens in Africa will and does affect Europe. Whatever happens in Asia will affect America, and whatever happens in Middle East will affect those of us in the Pacific, and vice versa. We live in one planet, one atmospheric envelope, one interlinked environmental ecosystem. Hence, as one humanity, we must rise and unite to preserve our one planet, our home. Not to do so is foolishness, and we are doing so at the peril of our children and their children, if, of course, Jesus Christ doesn't come back soon. Mr. President, Papua New Guinea recognizes the need to save Earth, and we too are contributing and will contribute to preserve our Earth. God has blessed Papua New Guinea with about 13% of world's tropical rainforest and 6% of its biodiversity. These global assets we want to preserve. One lesson I have learned from the COVID-19 experience is that oxygen is #1 human need. With less oxygen, and COVID-19 has shown us that, an individual suffocates and dies. Well, you ask this question: who produced the oxygen for Mother Earth? The trees, of course. If the world's rainforest reservoir were a global lung, we in Papua New Guinea have a significant proportion of this organ that keeps the world breathing. We also function as a great carbon sink. We have this significant asset for our planet. And I, as chair of the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, Papua New Guinea stands at an important crossroad. We are a net remover of the carbon from the atmosphere. The removal capacity from our forests is...
The kickoff was a paper that we wrote in 2017 in which we showed the sperm count in West.
And best wishes to His Excellency Abdullah Shahid on your assumption of the presidency of the 76th session of the General Assembly. We are indeed delighted to see
the risk of breast cancer. But why?
So